British civil servant. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 26 Transfer. In fact, I can understand the protest from the Congress Party, but due to my responsibility as the Hyderabad Commissioner and my respect for the monarch Ali Khan, I cannot stop the enthusiasm of the Hyderabad side for this gathering, and I have no reason to stop it. This one-on-one meeting was actually beyond Alan Wilson's expectations, but he quickly cleared himself of responsibility according to the previous explanation. However, General Mountbatten had a playful look on his face, with a half smile, worthy of being the British Long Ocean. Such a calm look made Alan Wilson unconsciously shut his mouth. I've heard this kind of talk more times than you have. Reaching out to pick his ears, General Mountbatten commented with some amusement, "Look at you civil servants, you say these words that no one can understand every day, and you think you are very smart, but what is the reality? You hold a meeting for small matters and make decisions based on your own ideas for big matters." Mountbatten's face, which seemed like a sculpture, was full of immunity to dialogue, and then he changed the subject and said to himself, "It's just that I didn't expect that you would use your connections to connect with my daughter, which is very surprising. To be honest, I don't know and don't want to know what your purpose is, but now is a critical moment when victory is in sight. British India must not have any problems. If there are problems, victory may be delayed by one day." For General Mountbatten, the most important thing now is to win the world war. Compared with Europe, where news of victory has been received at any time, things in Asia are not particularly clear. In General Mountbatten's mind, the result of victory is naturally the same as Germany. The Allies invaded the Japanese mainland and cleared up the entire country of Japan to ensure that this country will not become a threat in the future. Seeing Mountbatten's immune rhetoric, Alan Wilson was a little dumbfounded. Come to think of it, the other party was born in such a high family, grew up in praise, and was in contact with dignitaries. Moreover, Mountbatten has always been famous for his communication. He solved the problem of coordination between the British troops and other allied troops as soon as he came to India. He is definitely not useless as people think. To be honest, I want to make concessions to Nehru on this matter. Of course, I have learned from Sir Baron that the Congress Party is not very tough on you, but I still want to do it." Mountbatten held his head with one hand and said calmly, "The reason is just like what I said just now. Before the victory is about to come, I don't want any negative factors to appear." When Alan Wilson heard this, was he going to be killed as a warning to the monkey? His face changed, and he had to explain. "I decided to transfer you away from British India." General Mountbatten said to himself, "This is not out of selfishness, and it has nothing to do with Pamela. It's just a temporary transfer." "Temporary transfer?" Alan Wilson muttered, not quite understanding what Mountbatten meant. "Only on the surface, it is acceptable to the Congress Party." General Mountbatten explained, "The situation on the European battlefield is very good now. The Allies have broken through the Rhine defense line, and Berlin is within reach, not to mention the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front. In fact, the joy of victory will come at any time. The moment the war ends is the most chaotic time. Let me explain here that this is not a punishment for you, but just let you leave British India temporarily, so that you can do things more maturely when you come back." Alan Wilson stared at Mountbatten's expression with some impoliteness, but immediately realized that he shouldn't do so. But it seems that the other party has no reason to deceive himself. "I have a good relationship with Winston. I can write a recommendation letter for you. Which department do you like the working atmosphere of?" Mountbatten said this, and asked in an inquiring tone. Mountbatten did not lie at all. He did have a very good relationship with the current Prime Minister Churchill. This is only part of the fact. The whole fact is that he has a good relationship with all the senior officials of the allied countries he has contacted, almost without exception. At this time, Alan Wilson woke up from his dream. He quickly went through some departments in his mind and said uncertainly, "Foreign Ministry? Foreign Ministry? It is somewhat similar to your current job, but I think the Colonial Ministry is the most suitable for you." General Mountbatten thought for a while and shook his head. Of course, the European war is the most important thing at present. You can get a lot of experience in this process. So, the British Minister of India Leo Emery and I have a good relationship. I asked him to recommend you to work in the colonial ministry, but temporarily seconded to the foreign ministry to wait in Europe. Once Japan can't hold on in the Asian battlefield, I will let you come back. Europe, the front line of the US-Soviet confrontation, the Berlin Wall. Thinking of this, Alan Wilson sighed that this is indeed a good place. From the day Germany surrendered, the wonderful history entered another stage. You don't want to go? General Mountbatten tilted his head and said with a face full of arrogance, this is an opportunity. Of course I am. I'm very willing to take on greater challenges. Alan Wilson opened his mouth, knowing that the matter was a foregone conclusion. I don't know when I will leave. I'll give you a few days to deal with things. I heard that you have a good relationship with Ali Khan, which is commendable. You can spend the rest of your time saying goodbye to your friends. Mountbatten didn't know why he felt relieved. Until now, Alan Wilson still believed that this British Dragon Ocean was just looking for an excuse to get himself out of British India, until he took Mountbatten's two handwritten letters, one to Prime Minister Churchill and the Indian Colonial Secretary Leo Emery. Go to Sir Baron to arrange a trip to Europe, keep these two letters, and do your own things in the remaining free time. General Mountbatten said, holding his own handwritten letter in his hand. You just saw the content of the letter, so you can rest assured now. At least on the surface, Alan Wilson did roll out of India in disgrace in front of the Congress Party. This was an explanation from the British Indian Governor's office to the Congress Party. What a surprise. Sir Baron shook his head slightly and said, in fact, we could have ignored the protest of the Congress Party, but with these two letters, maybe it's really a good thing. Does Sir Baron think so? After hearing what the head of the British Indian civil servants said, Alan Wilson suddenly became optimistic. He also felt that this was not a bad thing. I didn't say anything. Good things and bad things are sometimes the same thing. Sir Baron pondered for a moment and said, at least you are free these few days. Forget all your troubles, relax, and then go to Mumbai to take a boat. There is no danger on the sea now. After leaving Sir Baron, Alan Wilson immediately rushed to the next occasion. It was my father who transferred you away. Pamela Mountbatten whispered angrily. Why is he like this? He takes those Indians too seriously. I'll go find him. That's not a bad thing. Reaching out and grabbing the corner of Pamela Mountbatten's clothes, Alan Wilson shrugged and said, if possible, you should pay more attention to Hyderabad. My assistants are doing a good job. You seem to be very happy to leave British India? Pamela Mountbatten asked with some doubt. I'm heartbroken. I'll deal with this matter when I come back. Alan Wilson pouted his lower lip and blew the hair on his forehead lightly. It's a good thing to go back to London. I just finished writing my graduation thesis. I just got home and started at 5 in the morning and drove all day. Chapter 27 Mumbai. There is no such thing as being happy or unhappy. Alan Wilson just felt that there was a lot to be done in this era, that's all. Although it was unfortunate that he caught up with the decline of the British Empire, the collapse of order inevitably brought opportunities that were rare in the past. If he wanted to do business, he could easily live a good life, but he didn't want to do that. He would rather be a humble social tool and serve the country. And then again, which capitalist who is worth a name has not risen through political benefits? The whole world cannot say that there are no people who can crush all difficulties by themselves. This does not conform to the objective law of development. Even in a strict filter, there are always some fish that slip through the net. But who says that the two cannot be achieved at the same time? Alan Wilson pulled Pamela Mountbatten's clothes and thought for a while. By the way, you once said that you were a student of the Oriental College and did not graduate because of the outbreak of the war. Hey, how old were you at that time? Pamela Mountbatten suddenly remembered that Alan Wilson had talked about his resume. That's not a big deal. Geniuses are born among ordinary people. Alan Wilson briefly mentioned his resume, with a raised corner of his mouth showing a smug look. You look just like my father. Pamela Mountbatten pouted and said with a look of disgust, can't you be like me and keep a normal attitude towards everyone? Maybe I really can't understand the approachability of your father who was born in a prince's family and your mother who is from the richest family in Britain. I can't understand how hard your father, who is the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces in Southeast Asia, and your mother, who is commanding 60,000 medical staff, to support the front line, work. Alan Wilson tilted his head with a look of knowing his mistake, but I'm ready to return to London. During this time, I hope to get Pamela's help here. Reaching out and patting Alan Wilson's shoulder, Pamela Mountbatten said, as if it was up to her, leave it to me. Alan Wilson rolled his eyes at the other party, stretched out his fingers to clamp the girl's small hand, and placed it in front of himself. With the other hand, he took it out of his pocket and put it on Pamela Mountbatten's hand. The size is right. A sapphire ring suddenly appeared on Pamela Mountbatten's finger. The latter said embarrassedly, what is this for? Why do you always give me gems? It's just a souvenir. This time I'm back in London, I have some things to bring. My father has some personal belongings to ship, which may be a hassle. Alan Wilson made a request with a frown. Is the quantity large? Pamela Mountbatten asked softly, ignoring her pounding heart for the time being. It's really not small. The old man has the habit of collecting local ancient books, which is quite troublesome to transport. It just so happens that I will take them back with me when I go back this time. They are all his lifelong collections. I have the obligation to keep these ancient books. Alan Wilson seemed to think about it, and it was actually less than 20 tons of things. Because of the continuation of the war, the sea route was not safe. The proceeds from the Golden Temple in India have always been kept in India. In fact, there is no good way. After all, it is wealth of unknown origin and cannot be kept in the bank. Moreover, the father and son do not trust the banks in British India very much, so they have always been kept in their residence in New Delhi. Alan Wilson took Pamela Mountbatten directly to his residence. Of course, there were really some books among them. Obviously, Pamela Mountbatten was not very interested and expressed her willingness to help. The daughter of the commander-in-chief of the Southeast Asia Theatre is domineering, and Alan Wilson silently gave her a thumbs up in his heart. To the assistant in Hyderabad, Alan Wilson did not say in the telegram that he was transferred, but only stated that he was temporarily seconded to the mainland. This is also the meaning of the well-known appraiser Sir Baron, which is a fact after all. It may disappear for a while, but the Hyderabad commissioner is temporarily vacant. Before, the Hyderabad commissioner was also a high-ranking, generous but not very important position. How can you go to a man's house alone? Mountbatten looked his daughter up and down and said helplessly, I can understand that you are friends, but it is slightly inappropriate for your age. Father, look at what you said. Alan is the Hyderabad commissioner, a restrained civil servant, and respects me very much. Pamela Mountbatten wore a sapphire ring on her hand, and I want to go to Mumbai to watch him board the ship. Me. Mountbatten was about to open his mouth, but his face changed, and he changed his mind. I'll send someone to take you there. Alan's father has a collection of collections to be shipped back to the country. I hope to ship it back in his name, because there are a lot of ancient books. Pamela Mountbatten asked further, and after getting the nod, she got up and went upstairs. I'm going to write a letter to my sister and give it to her to take back to London. Tomorrow I'm going to the suburbs with him. That's it for now. For now. Mountbatten thought about it and realized that it was only for now. After that, the other party would return to Europe, and it wouldn't be a problem. We are better than these Indian children, so we can give them charity like this. Alan Wilson held Pamela Mountbatten's hands and crossed them together, with blue light flashing on his fingertips, looking at the Indian children not far away. Today, the two came to the northern suburbs for an outing. The so-called northern Indian climate does not mean that there is no winter. Winter is also very difficult to endure. It's just that the winter is short and the summer is long. In the 3 months since he took office as the Commissioner of Hyderabad, the temperature in New Delhi has been moving step by step towards an unbearable direction. My father and I have asked for leave. I will send you to Bombay when you leave. Pamela Mountbatten came back to her senses, ignored the embellishments around her, and said softly, if your assistant in Hyderabad has any difficulties, just contact me then. My hands are sweating. taking out a handkerchief to wipe the sweat off Pamela Mountbatten's hands. Alan Wilson whispered, "I will send you a telegram when I return to London." "What telegram do you want to send me?" Pamela Mountbatten refused with a serious look. "It's as if you don't have a job. This is a letter from me to my sister. Please help me deliver it. My mother has been in London for half a year. Please give me my regards." "Don't worry." Alan Wilson agreed without hesitation, patting his chest. On the day of departure, after much effort, Alan Wilson boarded the train to Mumbai. Pamela Mountbatten, who was sitting next to him, asked suspiciously, "Why are the boxes so heavy?" "They make the soldiers tired. The boxes are made of iron, and the paper is very heavy when piled together. It's like whether a knife is sharp. You have to judge it by cutting paper." Alan Wilson used nonsense to compare and cover up the extraordinary weight. When they arrived in Mumbai, the freighter was scheduled to depart the next day. Pamela Mountbatten looked at the busy port with interest, as if she wanted to walk along the beach tirelessly. Alan Wilson said at the right time, "In fact, the coastline of Junagadh state is beautiful. I will take you to see it, if I have a chance." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 28, Dawn of Victory. In terms of mentality, Alan Wilson was definitely more clear-headed than anyone else. He was about to roll out of British India in disgrace under the tyranny of the Congress Party, and he still had time to lay mines here so that Pamela Mountbatten could visit Junagadh when she had time. Did he forget the interests of the princely states because he left British India? This was absolutely not the case. Even if he went to Europe, he could make contributions to the various Maharajas on the South Asian subcontinent. In a sense, he could even do better. Although he was not a commissioner of the Hyderabad state for a long time, Alan Wilson, with his sincere attitude, successfully established an image of dedication in front of Ali Khan. If he was not British, Ali Khan was even prepared to let Alan Wilson be the minister of Hyderabad. Among those who came to Mumbai to see him off was the Minister of Finance of Hyderabad, but in Alan Wilson's view, with such a miserly monarch, the Minister of Finance had very limited room to play. Pamela Mountbatten was there, and Alan Wilson introduced Pamela's identity. The other party was overjoyed and praised, "Commissioner, it can be seen that London seconded you to return to the country temporarily, just to let you play a greater role in the future. This way our Maharaja will be relieved." After that, he took out the prepared gift, a palm-sized box, and opened it to see that it was full of gems. "This is all because of the country's attention to me." Alan Wilson certainly knew that this was entirely because of Pamela Mountbatten. If she really returned to the country in disgrace, the other party might not take out the box, but take it back. "Give my regards to Maharaja Ali Khan. Although I'm temporarily returning to the country, my heart has always been with Hyderabad. This is my personal promise." Alan Wilson was about to leave the place where he had worked for a long time, but he was very relaxed and maintained his always optimistic attitude, which even affected Pamela Mountbatten. As for the gems sent by Ali Khan, he also handed them over to Pamela Mountbatten. "Don't you care about wealth?" Holding a box of colorful gems in her hand, Pamela Mountbatten's mind was blank, and she was completely confused about the person in front of her. "Of course I care, otherwise why would I bring these big boxes? These boxes are actually empty, and the gold is in the steel interlayer. The time spent designing these boxes is not even comparable to the time I spent in college." Although thinking so, Alan Wilson still pretended to be open-minded and said, "Precious and not precious must be compared. It depends on what these gems are compared with. To me, they are really just stones." Before leaving, Alan Wilson showed that he regarded money as dirt, and had a face that was so awesome that he could make me feel bad. In front of Pamela Mountbatten, his image immediately became taller. The freighter at the dock had already blown the whistle, and Alan Wilson smiled and said goodbye to Pamela Mountbatten. "Then, respected Miss Pamela, we will meet again, and there is. I will take care of your assistance." Pamela Mountbatten raised her head and said, "First, you can write a letter when you have time, and take my regards to my mother and sister." Extending a thumbs up, To give Pamela Mountbatten the thumbs up, Alan Wilson waved and boarded the freighter. "Let's go back to New Delhi too." Pamela Mountbatten smiled and greeted the soldiers around her. "Thank you so much." While Alan Wilson was on his long sea journey, the European battlefield had reached a critical moment. The Allied forces on the Western Front launched the Ruhr campaign, hoping to join forces with the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front. The Allied forces commanded by Eisenhower faced Field Marshal Model, who was a firefighter in Germany. But this was a different time. Compared with when he was a firefighter on the Eastern Front, Model was facing a worse situation at this time. Berlin transferred a large number of troops to the Eastern Front to resist the threat of the Soviet Red Army to Berlin. The Allied forces on the Western Front had an absolute advantage in manpower and weapons, and the Air Force carried out interdiction bombing before the campaign was launched. When Alan Wilson arrived in London, the Ruhr campaign had entered its final stages. The newspapers on the streets of London were all about Model's suicide and the victory news that the German army on the Western Front had collapsed across the board. At this time, everyone knew that the destruction of Germany was not far away. Who would have thought that a few years ago, the Germans looked invincible? Alan Wilson, holding a newspaper, shrugged and got off the ship with his box. The first thing to do was to keep these priceless treasures properly. Then he fulfilled his duties and became a qualified messenger. It must be said that the traces of the war are still very obvious. For example, there are women all over the streets, but few men of the right age. This has greatly improved Alan Wilson's sense of existence. Compared with before the outbreak of the war, the depression in London is visible. When the war is coming to an end, the problem facing many people is how to restore the vitality of London after the war. However, compared with the depression in London, the cities on the European continent are now a real gloomy fog. For many people, life after the war is no easier than during the war. The only country that was not affected by the World War may be the United States, where the mainland was not attacked. Alan Wilson just returned home, stored the boxes sent, and started his messenger work without stopping. On the list of people to whom the letter was sent were Prime Minister Churchill and Secretary of State for Leo Emery. If he went to Whitehall, he might also meet Cabinet Secretary Edward Bridges. Edward Bridges led the Cabinet Office to cope with World War II brilliantly. Whitehall is a street in London, England. It connects the Houses of Parliament and Downing Street. On this street, and in its vicinity, some British government agencies such as the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Home Office, and the Admiralty are located here. Therefore, people use Whitehall as a synonym for the British Administrative Department. This does not include the fact that he had to accept a conversation with Mi-6. After all, it was a wartime period, and whether he was loyal to the British Empire was a very important issue, not to mention that Alan Wilson himself was an informant stationed abroad. Of course, the top one was still Pamela Mountbatten's letter. After temporarily settling these empty boxes, he went to Mountbatten's residence in London according to the address. There was no repeat of the mistake of the first time to deliver the documents. Mountbatten's wife Edwina Ashley and eldest daughter Patricia Mountbatten were at home, which was even easier than in New Delhi. At least the guards were not so strict. However, the luxury was no less than the villa in New Delhi. Mountbatten's wife Edwina Ashley's family background was obvious. Her marriage with Mountbatten could be described as a strong alliance. "I came from the Indian colony. Pamela asked me to deliver the letter." After saying that he had no ill intentions, Alan Wilson entered the living room and introduced himself. "Do you work in British India? How is the situation over there? Is Pamela okay?" Patricia Mountbatten asked questions with great interest after hearing the purpose of the visit. "It's okay. British India is generally calm." Alan Wilson was quite helpless. He was a little tired of this kind of soul-searching question. "I don't know if it is the sequel of Pamela Mountbatten. The contract status has not been changed yet. This time the express delivery is a bit of a drag on me." Chapter 29. India is a good place. "I'm worried that Pamela is not used to living in British India." Patricia Mountbatten walked to the sofa and sat down. Then there was a crisp spring sound, which can only be made when under pressure. In his previous life, when he was very young, Alan Wilson had seen this kind of spring sofa, but he didn't expect to see it again in London. The war in Asia is still unclear, and General Mountbatten is still busy. As for Pamela, she is very comfortable. Alan Wilson organized his words and talked about life in British India. Then he said, Pamela and I are friends. This time when she returned to London from British India, she asked me to bring a letter. I believe this letter is full of her thoughts for the two ladies. As a mother, I should actually be by her side to take care of her. But my rescue duty prevents me from going to India now. Edwina Ashley read the letter while helplessly narrating. Edwina Ashley is responsible for training the British Rescue Force and launching battlefield rescue. Now is the World War, and this medical team has 60,000 people. This is what Alan Wilson said. Of course, he couldn't understand the Mountbatten couple's approachable. Madam, when I got off the ship, I heard that a decisive battle had been won in the European battlefield. I believe that the citizens of the British Empire will usher in the news of the final victory in a short time. You may not be so busy then. Alan Wilson bowed his head slightly and said politely, I hope so. Edwina Ashley nodded with a smile. Because of her daughter's letter, she was in a very good mood. She chatted with Alan Wilson for a few more words and asked about the situation in British India. You have been working in British India for a long time. What kind of place is that? In fact, Edwina Ashley didn't know much about British India, which surprised Alan Wilson. In other words, the other party might not know Nehru yet. Ahem. How could she think of Nehru? But what if she thought of it? He returned to Europe because of Nehru. So what? Alan Wilson, who cleared his throat, frowned slightly, as if he had something to hide. He said with an unpleasant expression, in fact, the environment in British India is not as peaceful as the telegram said. Of course, it is not like this in New Delhi, and I used to work in Hyderabad in South India, so I can introduce a little bit of Indian society outside New Delhi. Is the situation in British India very bad? Patricia Mountbatten asked with some concern when she saw this expression. The British residential area in New Delhi is very good, and the upper class people in India are very good, but from the perspective of India as a whole, it is really a very divided society. There are people without clothes, and not enough food everywhere. Because of religious reasons, there are often vendettas. The upper class people in India look gentle and elegant, but they turn a blind eye to the miserable situation of the people. As soon as Alan Wilson started talking, his mouth tended to be unable to close. He slandered British India from top to bottom, especially in front of Edwina Ashley, deliberately doing so, comparing British India to a big pit of toilets. This is not a metaphor, it is what it is. Who made him do a good job as the Commissioner of Hyderabad, but Nehru made trouble for him, and he had to return to London with a pile of iron boxes in a shabby state. This hatred is irreconcilable. Even if he is not there, the wealth of the Indian people will be squandered. Alan Wilson thinks it is better to give it to himself than to others. Even the areas where Indians live in Delhi are in disorder. If you follow the words of the chief executive of Bengal, Indians will breed like cockroaches at any time, even if they don't know where their next meal is. Alan Wilson, who holds the idea of irreconcilable hatred, directly told Pamela Mountbatten's sister and mother the most real side of British India. So it's such a place. It must be a bit hard for father to work there. Patricia Mountbatten looked at her mother in surprise. Fortunately, father and sister live in the British residential area, otherwise it would be unimaginable. The telegram only says good things. Edwina Ashley was also a little scared. I didn't expect British India to be such a place. I thought it was a good place. Dear madam, it's just that British India is important to the British Empire because British India has a huge population and uses cheap labor to produce agricultural products for the local area and serves as a sales place for local industries. But this good thing is supported by an unimaginable population. You can imagine that British India has a population 10 times that of the local area, but only half of the local tax revenue. You can imagine what kind of life the locals live. Having worked in British India, I'm not willing to talk about the lives of the lowest level of people. After Alan Wilson criticized British India, he said that this was not his purpose and shirked the responsibility. I'm really worried about my husband and daughter now. Edwina Ashley smiled and thanked Alan Wilson. Pamela mentioned you in the letter. You are friends, right? It's amazing that you have become a regional commissioner. It's just work. Alan Wilson was not modest. Compared with the British dragon proud of Mountbatten, he had nothing to be proud of. as long as Edwina Ashley created a first impression in front of her before she went to India and stigmatized British India, she would go to verify the real situation of British India, even if she went to India later. Even so, Alan Wilson still felt that it was not enough. He almost forgot the most important thing and said seriously, according to our statistics, the social environment in British India is particularly unfriendly to women. Indian men will stare at light-skinned women. Ordinary Indian men are extremely narcissistic and feel good about themselves. When talking to women, their expressions are exaggerated and their words and deeds are very frivolous. Crimes against women are too common. Pamela can't feel this when she lives in the British residential area. I have said similar things to her before. It turns out that this is the case. Edwina Ashley frowned, and her impression of British India was already very bad. Patricia Mountbatten was also the same. Both of them were women, and were extremely disgusted with this environment. In Alan Wilson's words, British India was a poor and smelly place that treated women like hell. Before the two of them went to British India and met Mountbatten, who was about to become the Governor General of India, they stigmatized India first. After doing all this, Alan Wilson felt very happy and even wanted to raise his middle finger in the direction of India, especially to Nehru. Chapter 30 Me6. Whitehall is a street in London, England. It connects the Houses of Parliament and Downing Street. On this street and nearby, some British government agencies such as the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Home Office, and the Admiralty are located here. Therefore, people use Whitehall as a synonym for the British Administrative Department. And in the southwest corner of Whitehall is 10 Downing Street, the symbol of the British government. The long wartime system is slowly being lifted. At least for the civil servants in Whitehall, they have become accustomed to running around in various departments every day and processing information sent back from various battlefields. Edward Bridges, who rubbed his eyes with one hand, had just finished a routine meeting as a cabinet secretary. He asked his secretary to invite Norman Brooke, the nominal civil servant, to come over. Taking this opportunity, Edward Bridges lit a cigarette. At present, the cabinet secretary and the civil servant in the civil service system are not the same person. Edward Bridges and Norman Brooke jointly lead the civil servant group in Whitehall to assist Prime Minister Churchill in dealing with a world war that is coming to an end. However, as the leader of the Cabinet Office Committee, Cabinet Secretary Edward Bridges is obviously busier than the civil servant. Edward, have you finished the meeting with all departments? Before Norman Brooke came in, his voice had already entered Edward Bridges' cabinet office. He walked in just in time to see the cabinet secretary thinking about life. Norman, you know, unlike the prime minister and ministers, we who do things are always busy. Edward Bridges forced a smile, then put out the cigarette in his hand, motioned for a seat, and then said, "It seems that there is news from the front. Berlin seems to be captured by the Soviet Red Army. Considering the losses the Soviet Union suffered from the invasion of Germany, this is as it should be." Norman Brooke said indifferently, "And the Americans don't seem willing to oppose this. We have limited influence on this matter." Americans? The Americans are simply deliberately humiliating us. Edward Bridges said with an unchanging expression. It's hard to imagine that Americans are more willing to listen to the opinions of the Soviets than to us. Norman Brooke shrugged. He knew that what the cabinet secretary said was true, and then said, "After the war, Whitehall has no less things to do than during the war. Think about the large number of demobilized soldiers returning to their homeland, and the status of some colonies. Even how to divide the German-occupied areas can be regarded as trivial matters in the face of these issues." Edward Bridges scratched his itchy scalp, and had to admit that the other party made sense. Norman Brooke was about to speak to comfort him, when he saw the letter on the table. He pointed at it and asked, "What is this?" "It's a letter from Mountbatten to the Prime Minister. It was delivered by my secretary. A commissioner from British India returned to the country, and brought this letter to the Prime Minister. We have already gone through the necessary checks. The other letter is to the Indian Colonial Secretary Leo Emery. I have sent someone to deliver it to the Department of Indian Affairs." Edward Bridges explained, "I have asked the commissioner who came back to report on his work to go to Me6. It's just right that he's back. We can get first-hand information about British India and let Me6 ask about this." Norman Brooks slapped his thigh and said, "The current situation in the colonies around the country is a major problem after the war. We have to solve it sooner or later. The various parties are arguing fiercely now. I have a feeling that after the war, Congress will immediately start a fierce argument." You're right. I neglected it. By the way, since we are back from India, let's find a senior Mi-6 official who knows the local situation to verify it. I happen to have such a person in mind. Edward Bridges picked up the phone. The headquarters of Mi-6 is on the same street, so it's very convenient to transmit information. Alan Wilson was idling in a huge 20-story building, looking at the scenery outside through the window. It was hard to imagine that this building, which belonged to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was the current headquarters of Mi-6. But then again, spies and diplomats do have certain similarities. Some people say that diplomats are legal spies, and what they do is basically similar. Soon, a man in his 30s with thick hair came in wearing a well-dressed suit. He said politely, "Is it the Hyderabad commissioner who returned home?" Alan Wilson, right. "I'm sorry for being late. I was sent to find out some information. We can just chat casually. By the way, my name is Harold King Philby. You can just call me Harold. The reason why I was asked to talk about the situation in India is because I was born in British India." Philby sat in front of Alan Wilson and said with a smile, and Alan Wilson relaxed. Harold King Philby was born in Ambala, India. His father was a civil servant in the Indian government and a well-known Arabic language scholar in the UK. His parents had high expectations for little Philby. When Philby reached school age, he was sent back to school in the UK to study. So Mr. Philby was born in British India. Alan Wilson nodded in understanding and introduced the current situation in British India, focusing on the situation in Hyderabad. Finally, he added, "I believe Mr. Philby has a certain understanding of British India. In fact, it is hard for me to believe that someone as gentle as you is actually engaged in intelligence work. There is nothing strange about this. Intelligence work especially likes to find reserve forces from Oxford University and Cambridge University." Philby looked down at Alan Wilson's file and explained indifferently, then changed the subject with some surprise. "Are you a student of the Oriental College of Oxford University? The enrollment age is so young. For you, the outbreak of war may be bad news and delay your studies. In fact, working early is not a bad thing." Alan Wilson looked at Philby's face and asked with an idea in his mind, "I didn't know that the intelligence department likes to recruit personnel from well-known universities. So that's the case. Where did Mr. Philby complete his studies?" Philby looked up at Alan Wilson and smiled in a calm voice. "When I was in school, I was at Cambridge University and Trinity College. If I had also completed my studies at Oxford University, I could be considered your senior." "Oh." Alan Wilson heard this without changing his expression, but suddenly realized something. Trinity College, Cambridge? Born in British India? It seems that there is such a person among the Cambridge Five. Well, Whitehall wants to get first-hand information about British India, so I am talking to you." Philby, who had been smiling since entering the room, said that he had finished the questioning. "I just came back from British India and I'm a little unfamiliar with London. If there is a chance, I would like to go around with Mr. Philby." Alan Wilson started the invitation. He was very interested in the Cambridge Five. Chapter 31 Work Arrangements. Alan Wilson didn't think of catching all the Cambridge Five in exchange for a promotion, as he wasn't very poor. It would be best if he could get a certain amount of room for advancement, but considering his age, this hope didn't seem to be very great. He was such a realistic person that he wouldn't do such a risky thing before seeing the benefits. So for the Cambridge Five, a group of masterpieces in the history of the Soviet KGB, he just wanted to have a simple contact with them. The only contact he had with Philby was that he lived in British India for a period of time, so he could only think of a way from this aspect. After returning to London, Alan Wilson actually had a complicated mind. It was naturally politically correct to be anti-Soviet in the British civil service system, and there were very few people like the Cambridge Five who had a good impression of the Soviet Union. His idea was rather special. He was anti-Soviet for his own interests, but at the same time, he was also anti-American. After the war, the British Empire seemed to have to give way to the United States and the Soviet Union, but strictly speaking, it was not sunset at this moment, but dusk had come. During this process, the relationship between Britain and the United States was definitely not a special alliance. In the process of the disintegration of the British Empire, the United States and the Soviet Union were actually the same. Even on the issue of colonies, the United States contributed more to the disintegration of the British Empire than the Soviet Union. After the war, the Soviet Union lost a huge amount of population and wealth. Even if it wanted to do something, it was powerless in the short term. It still takes time to digest the influence of Eastern Europe after the war. It is not as arrogant as the 1960s when it slapped the United States in the face. Therefore, in the first period after the war, the British Empire will undoubtedly face the pressure from the United States. In terms of colonies, Britain and France are allies. In the short term, they resist the pressure from the United States, and in the long term, they face the pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union. After the conversation, Alan Wilson invited Philby to find a place to have a drink after get off work. This proposal was not rejected, and Philby readily agreed. Then I'll go first. We'll see each other when you get off work. Alan Wilson shook hands with Philby and said, you know, there are not many people who have experience as civil servants in British India. I just returned to London and some things are still unfamiliar to me. I'm very willing to help. Philby responded in an equally friendly manner. Just like you said, it's a good thing to have friends to help. When Alan Wilson left the MI6 headquarters building, Philby restrained his smile and thought for a moment before leaving. Philby was fundamentally different from other members. His other friends had more or less idealized imaginations of the Soviet Union, but he, who worked in the intelligence department, did not have beautiful fantasies about the Soviet Union. He did not think that this country, which started all over again and established a brand new system, would be able to solve all the current problems. Philby believed that it was very normal for a country to face various difficulties when it was just established, and for the entire human race, it was better to have more choices than only one choice, just like the Conservative Party and the Labour Party in the UK. If we look at the world, people can choose which system they want. Although serving the Soviet Union, Philby did not have the pure and beautiful fantasy of the Soviet Union that others had. This is also one of the reasons why he is the most destructive member of the Cambridge Five. Back to London. I believe your work is being arranged. But then again, it is a good thing for you to come back earlier. If British India must be independent, you will face great competition when you come back at that time. If you come back now, even if you go to work in British India, you will not be caught off guard at that time. Philby, holding a glass of wine in his hand, carefully analyzed the pros and cons for Alan Wilson. Does Harold also think that British India must be independent? Alan Wilson took a sip of whiskey and asked back. It is difficult to keep it. We also have to pay attention to the views of other countries, especially the other two big players. Philby shrugged and said, do you think we can withstand the pressure from the other two countries and keep India? It's impossible with the United States. Alan Wilson thought for a while and couldn't help but said dejectedly, in fact, it is now obvious that the Americans can be regarded as a suspicious ally, and the damage to the British Empire may even be greater than that of the Soviet Union. Oh, is that how you know it? Philby's face was uncertain. He took a sip from his glass to hide his gaze. I admit that what you say makes sense. Philby agreed after putting down his glass. Sometimes it's not so easy to define enemies and allies, especially for spies. Alan Wilson raised his eyebrows and said, I agree. You are absolutely right. In the Foreign Office building in Whitehall, Leo Emery, Minister of State for India, threw out a letter and placed it in front of Foreign Secretary Robert Anthony Eden. I would like to second one person from the Indian office to your department and temporarily return him to the Indian office. What do you think? Leo? What's the matter? Anthony Eden said puzzledly. Why is it so troublesome? I want to know this question too. Leo Emery sat down and smiled bitterly. This is a letter written to me by Mountbatten. Apart from some private social activities and the current situation in British India, this is it. The civil servant who sent the letter back was assigned to the Indian office, but he will temporarily work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's the situation. Does this count as a normal transfer? Anthony Eden hesitated at first, but suddenly made a sharp turn and said, but then again, the Foreign Office, the Colonial Office and the Indian Office do basically the same work, but they face different countries. I will let the permanent Undersecretary of the Foreign Office arrange this matter. I think it shouldn't be difficult. Even the Prime Minister received Mountbatten's letter. I heard it from the Cabinet Secretary. Leo Emery was surprised when he said this. What is the relationship between this civil servant and Mountbatten? Is he his son-in-law? The ages don't seem to match. Anthony Eden said with a smile, but the Foreign Office is very busy now. We can't ignore Mountbatten's opinions, especially for you. The Indian Affairs Department is in charge of the work of British India, so the opinions of the British Indian Governor's Office and India must be taken very seriously. Who let British India, a colony, support the work of the Indian Affairs Department? After learning that Mountbatten also wrote a letter to Prime Minister Churchill, Anthony Eden felt that he should hope that this civil servant would have a gilded job, not that he didn't. For example, now, when Berlin is conquered, the subsequent division of a series of occupied zones will need to be done by the Foreign Office. These jobs are easy to accumulate experience. As Foreign Minister Anthony Eden now knows what he should do. Chapter 32, Making Friends Out of Nothing. Find a way to send this civil servant that Mountbatten values to Germany, which is about to lose the war, to follow the Foreign Ministry's overseas personnel and assign post-war work in Germany with the Americans. These jobs will definitely add a lot of color to Alan Wilson's resume. The wartime cabinet had a surprisingly consistent understanding of Mountbatten, the commander of the Southeast Asian Theater of War with a noble background. Both the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs believed that Mountbatten was an irreplaceable candidate in coordinating multinational joint operations. Mountbatten's popularity, whether among ministers or civil servants, was only good and better. Anthony Eden was also happy to do a favor and arrange this young civil servant to work in a job suitable for gilding. Alan Wilson was very busy. He had just returned to London and left Mountbatten's house. He went to the Indian Affairs Department to report and became a liaison between the Indian Affairs Department and the British Indian Governor's Office. But this was exactly what he wanted. He just needed to keep in touch with British India and gladly accepted this job. He took out some free time and went directly to the Oriental College of Oxford University to get his student status back. Although he had not yet determined when he would graduate, he believed that day was not far away as the European battlefield was about to calm down. After finishing his studies, Alan Wilson found an opportunity to exchange some pounds at the Royal Bank of Scotland and then went to Mountbatten's home, introducing himself as a liaison officer for British India. If the mother and daughter wanted to contact their relatives in New Delhi, he could help. After receiving the gratitude of Mountbatten's wife and daughter, Alan Wilson still maintained his usual politeness and calmness, leaving a good impression on the mother and daughter. A week after he returned to London, Philby, still of Me6, informed Alan Wilson that the Indian Affairs Department decided to second him to the Foreign Office. He was still the liaison officer for British India in the Indian Affairs Department. Because the Foreign Office was now busy, he was not working for the Foreign Office for the time being. This is really unexpected. Alan Wilson pretended to be ignorant and asked, is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs very busy? I heard that the attack of the Soviet Red Army is very fierce. Germany may surrender at any time. I heard that there are indeed Germans who have contacted the Allies privately to surrender. Philby pondered for a moment and continued, once Germany surrenders, it may be even busier. There are many things to do, such as maintaining order in the occupied areas, communicating with local Germans, etc. The pound has been devalued. Alan Wilson heard that the war had reached this point. Germany was already exhausted, and the national economy had already collapsed completely. If it did not rely on external food, it might be a problem to eat now. Although none of the major belligerents in the World War, except the United States, had a prosperous day, but it also had to be divided into different levels of misery. The depression in London was much better than the devastated European continent. This is a huge tragedy, Alan Wilson said solemnly with a solemn face. Europe, the center of world civilization, has been devastated by 2 wars. I can imagine the great difficulties that the Germans are facing now. If I have the opportunity to help them, I'm willing to set off immediately. While the two were talking, the Battle of Berlin had actually been going on for several days. The Soviet army concentrated 270 infantry and cavalry divisions, 20 tank and mechanized armies, and 14 air force groups from the three fronts of the 1st and 2nd Belarusian fronts and the 1st Ukrainian front, totaling 2.5 million troops, 2,400 aircraft, 14,000 artillery pieces, 1,500 tanks and self-propelled artillery, to launch the Battle of Berlin. The battle began with artillery bombardment. Thousands of artillery and Katyusha rocket launchers began to bombard the German positions, and the bombardment lasted for several days. The Allied forces of the United States, Britain, France and other countries on the Western Front had already tacitly accepted the Soviet Red Army's occupation of Berlin. After hearing what Philby said, Alan Wilson knew that once Germany officially surrendered, he would almost have to go to Germany. Actually, this is a great opportunity. I have to admit that I envy you a little. General Mountbatten played a role in your appointment. Both the ministers of the wartime cabinet and the civil servants of various departments highly recognized General Mountbatten. Seeing that Alan Wilson did not speak, Philby said, "But I have something to remind you." Remind? Alan Wilson was stunned and asked in confusion, "Is there anything that needs special attention?" Philby smiled bitterly and shook his head slightly. "Alan, although the war will end soon, it does not mean that the danger will disappear. Because of the end of the war, there may be many German soldiers in Germany who are unwilling to surrender. These soldiers are also dangerous. Moreover, the relationship between the Allied forces and the Soviet army on the Eastern Front is also a little subtle. You know that as a commissioner of Mi-6, I don't want my friends to fall into the eyes of some unidentified countries." "Oh." Alan Wilson nodded in understanding. "Don't fall into the eyes of some unidentified countries? This unidentified country refers to the Soviet Union, right?" he said in a long tone. No way. He was just a small Hyderabad commissioner, and he really admired Philby. How could the man in front of him serve the Soviets while being loyal to the British Empire? Of course not. Our enemies can do anything. Philby's face was serious, and he said righteously, "I'm the commissioner of Mi-6. I must be more vigilant, but I don't want you to be targeted. After all, you are my friend." Alan Wilson really wanted to ask, "Is your friend talking about you?" As for the commissioner of Mi-6, if you were not the commissioner of Mi-6, you would not have caused such great damage to Britain. But then again, Alan Wilson was not averse to going to Germany. After all, Germany was an old power. If he went to the manure to pan for gold, he could find something that would be enough for the Indian princely state. He could also make some extra money. What made Alan Wilson unhappy was that a Soviet spy talked about being loyal to the British Empire in front of him. This was intolerable. Alan Wilson lowered his head for a moment, as if he suddenly understood what Philby said. Yes, Germany's war machine must have a lot of technology and talents needed by the Allies. When I arrive in Germany, I will definitely try my best to grab these talents. Philby was stunned, as if he was very surprised by Alan Wilson's words, and said in a strange tone, "You are right. The Allies will definitely search for these German military talents. I have something else to do, so I will go back first. Let's find a place to have a drink in the evening. I will also find some colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs." Looking at Philby's hurried back, Alan Wilson shouted, and saw Philby waving without looking back. He raised his head and blinked. He should have gone to inform the Soviet Union, right? Chapter 33 The second. Through Philby, who was in Britain, but his heart was in the Soviet Union, he explained that he couldn't wait to go to Germany to rob talents. This was of course intentional. The United States, Britain and France would have done the same thing, which was very reasonable. As for why Philby was told, it was not because Alan Wilson suddenly had a Soviet spirit and decided to devote his life to internationalism. In the final analysis, it was for the British Empire. In the war for talents after Germany's defeat in history, the United States was undoubtedly the biggest winner. With the Soviet system and the blood feud between the Soviet Union and Germany, German talents were afraid of serving the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had not reacted at first, and was taken advantage of by the United States, Britain and France. By the time they reacted, most of the talents had fallen into the hands of the United States, Britain and France. The Soviet Union could only accept some documents and materials for slow research and confiscate German factories to make up for the losses. The talents they robbed were better than nothing. On the side of the United States, Britain and France, the United States took the biggest advantage. The attractiveness of Britain and France after the war could no longer be compared with that of the United States. Alan Wilson gave the Soviets a reminder through Philby because he knew history in his mind. Even Stalin at that time might not know as well as he did what price the Soviet Union paid in this world war. The Soviet Union chose not to publish population statistics after the war. It was not until the 1950s and 1960s that it recounted the population and announced that 27 million people died in the war. This is the death toll, while China's 35 million are casualties, and China's population base is also larger. The Soviet Union's casualties are estimated to be 70 million, and the Soviet Union only had 160 million people, not counting the 3 Baltic countries annexed by the Soviet Union. Excluding half of the female population, the Soviet Union has reached an extremely weak level. When the war just ended, the Soviet Union, except for a powerful Soviet Red Army, could not be compared with the United States in any way. It was also because the Americans had just seen the throne of world hegemony and had not yet come out of their original thinking. If Britain and France were in the environment and status of the United States, the old imperialist thinking would have erupted, and they might have destroyed the Soviet Union without hesitation. The Americans still did not degenerate, and they were too timid in this regard. Alan Wilson leaked the talent snatch just to make the strength of the Soviet Union and the United States more balanced. If the US rocket technology can be slowed down for a year or two, it will be considered a success. It is a bit sad that Alan Wilson can only do this by aiding the enemy in this way. If important German talents fall into the hands of the British, it is almost the same as falling into the hands of the Americans. At this time, Britain will not fall out with the Americans because of a few military workers. Once the Americans put pressure on it, even if the British get this talent, it will most likely fall into the hands of the Americans in the end. Britain may not be able to stay, but the Soviet Union can be an enemy. If the strength is enough, he would rather be an enemy of the United States. As the liaison officer of the Indian Affairs Department for British India, he was temporarily seconded to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Alan Wilson's work relationship is temporarily in the Indian Affairs Department. Although he has just returned to London not long ago, he has made a group of friends in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Indian Affairs Department through necessary social activities. As we all know, few officials who resigned from British India and returned home were poor. Alan Wilson fits this character perfectly, and he was soon welcomed by many Whitehall civil servants. He was so well connected at such a young age. If Alan doesn't go to Europe, who will? Going back and forth between civil servants in the 2 departments, that's how he built up his network. During the war, a man who had just returned from a wealthy colony was of course welcomed by many people. Philby also came to the cocktail party and brought someone with him. He introduced Alan Wilson. "Alan, this is my friend. Let me introduce E. Francis Burgess, who used to be a BBC broadcaster. He also works in the Foreign Office now. It's a rare opportunity. Who knows, maybe one day he will be sent abroad to work like you. Hello, I heard Philby mentioned you." Burgess took the initiative to extend his hand and shook it with Alan Wilson. Alan Wilson also took the initiative to extend his hand, feeling a little disgusted. Another one. Among the members of the Cambridge Five, Philby is definitely the best in terms of family background, as Philby's father is an earl. Although the ranks of titles in Western Europe are similar, the value of titles varies in different countries. The great nobles in France are all dukes, and the noble marquesses in Germany are already very rare. The British side is more strict, and the earl is already considered to have a strong influence in the upper class. Although the Mountbatten family was born a prince, this prince is a title in Germany, not a British title. Except for the Prince of Wales, the rest of the princes in the UK are just titles, not real status, and the earl is already rare. When Burgess was studying at Cambridge, he became the most active member of the Cambridge Apostles Society, the most famous Cambridge Apostles Society at Cambridge University at that time, and the privileged pit club with many members of noble children. With his innate social skills, He became the most attractive person in these student clubs. I just heard that a very interesting person came back from India, and today is the first time we met. Europe is still relatively dangerous right now, so you must be careful when you go to Germany. Compared to Philby, Burgess seemed very familiar. He knew quite a few people and soon joined the crowd. Philby sat at Alan Wilson's table, holding a glass of wine and chatting. Do you have any clues about the upcoming departure? I haven't received a specific explanation yet, so I have nothing to say. Alan Wilson changed the subject and said, but from my personal point of view, the mission is of course, to disintegrate Germany's war machine. I think the most important thing in Germany's military industry is the rocket field and some new weapons that appeared at the end of the war. These weapons may not be mature yet, but once the relevant information reaches us in the UK, they will be more mature when they are developed. Also, the weapons and equipment left over from the war, should they be destroyed and sealed or something? Alan Wilson stopped and said embarrassedly, these are all my personal ideas, and we still need to wait for the department's planning. That's true. In fact, it doesn't need to be perfect. Being able to participate in it is already a rich resume. Philby comforted calmly, maybe dealing with the Allies will consume a lot of your energy. Well, Alan Wilson nodded in agreement, but he didn't know who the Allies Philby was referring to. Chapter 34 Operation Asorgan. Which clear enemy is it? The Soviet Union? Or the suspicious ally America? Oh, and maybe France. During the day, these people are the backbone of Whitehall and the backbone of the British Empire. At the cocktail party at night, what they say is no different from the ordinary people, and they have the gossip mentality. The technology that Alan Wilson said is worth plundering in Germany is actually the well-known rocket technology and some black technology inspired by the desperate period. Of course, most of the so-called black technology can be called defective products with immature technology and wild imagination. But the general direction is not wrong. Germany, which is desperate, applies semi-finished products to the war regardless of the technology content. Thinking of black technology, before the Soviet Union committed suicide, the giant ground effect aircraft of the Caspian Sea monster and the Shark-class nuclear submarine that is larger than an ordinary aircraft carrier are much better than the semi-finished products leaked by Germany now. A powerful country must have the necessary technological reserves, but losers will leak them. If the rebellious son of the British Empire, the United States, is unlucky one day, the leaked black technology may be even more frightening. However, in Alan Wilson's view, Germany's greatest black technology is uniforms. With these uniforms, countless people have been attracted to sing praises for Germany. What a heroic spirit. It is more lethal than the giant rat super heavy tank and the Silverbird aerospace plane. Burgess, who had walked around for a while, came back and sat next to Philby. He asked Alan Wilson, your work achievements and risks are linked. Everyone knows that going to the German occupied zone at this time will be a glorious and colorful stroke on your resume, but on the other hand, we can all imagine what the current European continent looks like. The armies on the east and west fronts have swept across Germany. Germany is not good at agriculture, and there are no overseas colonies to supplement it. Now even eating is a problem. Burgess is right. Philby nodded aside and said, even if Germany surrenders immediately, there is not much time left to start agricultural production. Tens of millions of Germans have to eat, which is a huge burden. It is now May. Historically, Germany surrendered at about this time. The farming season has passed. Even if it is planted now, it will not be able to grow in the second half of the year. Whether the Germans can have enough food depends entirely on the previous accumulation, if it is not robbed. It seems that only Americans can solve this problem. Alan Wilson was startled and said his thoughts. In this world, only the United States can solve the problem of feeding such a large population. Although in the agricultural era, the United States, which was always harvested by the Arctic cold wave, was not very good. No matter what, I hope Alan will be fine. If possible, help some poor people. Burgess was more sympathetic than Philby. Idealistic people have this problem. Alan Wilson also agreed very happily. He was going to do this anyway. After all, he was a civil servant of the British Empire. This was his duty. After the cocktail party, someone naturally paid the bill. A well-dressed man drove to pick up Alan Wilson. Civil servants from the two departments also left in 2s and 3s. They went to bed early and continued to serve the British Empire tomorrow. When he got home, Alan Wilson gestured to let Ali Khan's housekeeper in London come in. As soon as he sat down, he asked directly, "I don't know how the Maharaja feels about my idea. Can I borrow some funds temporarily?" Alan Wilson could certainly do it on his own to maintain his personality of not being short of money after returning from British India. But for the welfare of the people of Hyderabad, he could not invest on behalf of Ali Khan. One thing is one thing. If you take money to do things, you can make sense wherever you go. The Maharaja understands the contribution the commissioner has made to Hyderabad. The telegram has stated that he is willing to supply the commissioner with funds for his trip to Europe. The butler nodded calmly. It's just that the amount is relatively large. With the Maharaja's wealth, £1 million is not a lot of money. It is at best a suitable amount of money. I'm very grateful for the Maharaja's consideration, but I think of one more thing. Money alone cannot solve the problem. Alan Wilson thought for a moment and said, "Something else is needed." "What is needed?" The butler's heart skipped a beat. It was not because he was very loyal to Ali Khan and felt sorry for the wealth of the monarch of Hyderabad, but because things were getting going and he would be busy. Food and cigarettes are even more useful than money at this time. Alan Wilson said solemnly, "Now Germany has been plowed by war, and food shortages are high probability. If Ali Khan can set an example as a monarch in this matter, he can become a moral model in the cruel aftermath of the World War. I will do the rest and feed back the appropriate weapons to Hyderabad. Then I will contact the Maharaja now." The butler did not dare to neglect it, and was called back by Alan Wilson. "Collect some tobacco and alcohol first. The men in Germany suffered heavy losses in the war. We should first meet the needs of men. As for women, war keeps women away. Although men and women are cannon fodder in war, the value of cannon fodder and cannon fodder is different. Once a war breaks out, women's rights are bullshit. It's okay to make a fuss in peacetime. In wartime, the government will only give priority to men's rights. Whether you admit it or not, this is a fact. In Germany, where the war has just ended, tobacco and alcohol are definitely hard currency, which is much more useful than the mark, which is like waste paper, and maybe even more useful than the pound. Thousands of miles away, the weather in Eastern Europe is still very cool. In Lubyanka Square in Moscow, Merkulov, the director of the State Security Bureau, was busy writing documents at his desk. Suddenly, the phone on the table rang violently. "I'm Merkulov." Merkulov reached out to take the microphone, his eyes full of sharpness under his thick hair. "I'm Beria." A cold voice came from the other end of the microphone to introduce himself. Merkulov stood up straight and responded loudly, "General Political Commissar, what do you want?" "Mobilize the backbone personnel of the 1st Bureau and set off to Germany immediately to start the Assorgen operation, focusing on German scientists in the field of rockets." Beria ordered calmly. "All frontline troops must cooperate." "Yes." Merkulov responded with a loud voice, as if he had received a big thing, and a busy tone was heard from the other side of the microphone. "In fact, I found that I'm still better at the last part, but it's a pity that there is a big filter. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 35. The dust settles. After putting down the microphone, Merkulov quickly picked it up again and said, "I'm Merkulov. Connect me to the Special Operations Division. No matter what means are used, ensure the success of the operation. The Special Operations Division will set off immediately and do everything possible to bring back the talents needed by the great Soviet Union." Historically, Operation Assorgen was 3 months after the start of Operation Boomerang in the United States. The Soviet Union, which was late to the party, began to plunder scientists from the German military industry in October, when the war ended. Compared with the United States, which had already started this work in July when the war just ended, it had already lost the upper hand. In terms of execution, the Soviet Union was not only not at a disadvantage to the United States, but even had an advantage. It was just that at the beginning, the Soviets were filled with revenge on the Germans, and did not think of this. After an accidental news, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs learned that the United States, Britain and France had an action plan in this regard. They came to their senses and quickly launched Operation Sorgen. Using their strong execution power, they must get these scientists from the German military industry before the United States, Britain and France. The primary target was the German Army Rocket Research Center on the Baltic Sea coast, where the famous V-2 rocket was successfully developed. There were also the Soviet-occupied states of Saxony and Thuringia. Before Germany surrendered, a large number of researchers and equipment retreated from Berlin to these two states. In Operation Sorgen, Werner von Braun and his V-2 rocket research team were among them. Merkulov mobilized the Special Operations Department to rush to the front line and promised independent trial rights. Beria, who put down the phone, was also not idle. He directly contacted the Red Army commander who had already entered the city of Berlin, asking the frontline commander to pay close attention to relevant talents and protect Berlin's scientific research institutions. Beria then left the apartment directly and went to the Kremlin to prepare to report to Stalin. Because of an accidental, questionable, and source inaccessible intelligence, the war between the United States and the Soviet Union for German scientists was staged ahead of schedule, and this time it was the Soviet Union that took the lead. Later, Beria walked out of the Kremlin calmly, and he had obtained all the authorizations for this operation. The environment in the Soviet Union is still dangerous. Britain, France, and Germany are all European powers in terms of population and land. Britain and France started the journey of colonial empire 300 years ago, and Germany is also a well-known military empire. But what about the Eastern European countries on the Soviet side? They used to be countries with little presence, and now they are still. In order to narrow the gap with imperialism, Beria keenly realized that this action must be successful, and a huge success. Although the war is over, the secret war has begun. The invisible front has been put into action. On the devastated German land, a vigorous competition for talents has begun. In London, the British Empire civil servants who stayed out of the matter could only be busy with some trivial matters that had nothing to do with high tech, collecting some cigarettes and alcohol, preparing to go to the European continent, comfort the Germans who were defeated again, and panning for gold in the fezes. Maybe he should find an Indian assistant. After all, he might be more professional in panning for gold in the fezes. In fact, he was preparing to do so. He telegraphed Ali Khan to send a son to follow him to see the market. Because of Ali Khan's former status as the world's richest man, Alan Wilson never planned to do business with him. A one-time deal was not what he wanted, and long-term cooperation was foreseeable. It was not a rude decision to let Ali Khan get some food from Hyderabad. It was a very cost-effective deal to use some food from British India in exchange for an opportunity to be exposed worldwide. The residents of Hyderabad should also be considerate of the reputation of their monarch. For the monarch's worldwide fame, this small sacrifice can be overcome. Anyway, they don't necessarily eat much at ordinary times. The food and the tobacco and alcohol prepared in London were all handed over to Ali Khan's London butler. This was easier than him showing up himself. Although Ali Khan was far away in Hyderabad, he had more face than him. Ali Khan himself could even contact the British Bank in London to freeze the account directly from Hyderabad. As the liaison officer of the Indian Affairs Department for British India, Alan Wilson had the convenience to contact Hyderabad. On the other hand, his assistant working in Hyderabad helped him communicate with Ali Khan. Relationships need to be constantly managed. If there is no contact, even the best relationships will gradually fade. Although Alan Wilson is not extremely smart, he still understands the basics. In addition, he has a part-time job, which is to help Mountbatten's family in London and contact Mountbatten and his daughter in British India. The sequel is that he goes in and out of Mountbatten's home in London from time to time, acting as a messenger. The permanent undersecretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is making a list of people going to Europe, and I may be in office soon. Before leaving Mountbatten's home that day, Alan Wilson talked about his appointment. The contact with New Delhi will not be interrupted. I believe that the liaison officer of the Indian Affairs Department can understand General Mountbatten's longing for him. Europe is still dangerous now. Edwin Ashley nodded. The war is about to end. Work is still important. And I also want to see my husband and daughter. Madam's wish should be realized soon. But British India, hey. Alan Wilson hesitated. He still couldn't forget to show the real India in front of the other party. After waving goodbye to Mountbatten's family, Alan Wilson temporarily finished his work and was waiting to go to Europe to deal with the trivial matters after the war. There was no mistake in the wording. Trivial matters. The Battle of Berlin had reached its final moments. Over Berlin, thousands of Soviet planes once again dropped tens of thousands of tons of bombs and gasoline bombs. On the ground, nearly 1,000 guns of various types were deployed per mile for concentrated firing. After the bombing and shooting, Zhukov's first Belarusian front sent countless assault groups and assault detachments to rush into the city from all directions. Under the cover of tanks and engineers equipped with flamethrowers and blasting equipment, the infantry advanced in small sections, infiltrating from backyards, basements, and even subways and sewers, and captured every street and every building. The battle near the Reichstag was particularly fierce. The domed building had become an empty behemoth due to repeated bombings. 2 Soviet battalions rushed into the Reichstag. The Soviet troops that broke in immediately divided into groups to clear out the German troops on the first floor of the building floor by floor. The two sides engaged in fierce close combat in the rooms, on the stairs, and in the corridors. Almost all types of weapons were used, from daggers, bayonets, grenades to heavy machine guns and flamethrowers. Automatic weapons swept like the wind, and the walls of the building became honeycombed. At 2 p.m., the Reichstag was captured. When the news came, Hitler shot himself, and his successor, Faradanitz, confirmed the news. Chapter 36 Today's Insult. The news of Hitler's suicide was immediately published in major newspapers in London. Almost everyone, young or old, had a newspaper in their hands. The news of the death of the German leader who had once provoked the World War in the hearts of the British seemed to indicate that this World War, which had claimed tens of millions of lives, had come to an end. The dawn of peace had appeared, and many people breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that their families who were still in the war would return safely. As for how many German troops in Germany still did not believe that Hitler was dead and were still fighting for the great leader until the last moment, that was not something the British should care about. The time has not deviated too much, and the general direction of history has not been affected. After looking at the calendar, Alan Wilson locked the door and prepared to report to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The schedule to Europe had been set. On the streets of London, many pedestrians holding newspapers were cheering and looking forward to the return of their families. Are you going to Whitehall? The war is over, and our families will be back safely soon. I don't know if it is a common problem all over the world, but drivers are very talkative, just like the taxi driver who took Alan Wilson. Most people should come back to live a peaceful life, although the war in the Far East has not ended. But there are mainly relying on the Expeditionary Force and the Indian Corps to recover the lost territory. I believe that good news will come in a few months. Alan Wilson answered politely, looking at the jubilant crowd outside. What is there to be happy about? Waiting for her husband to come back happily, and then happily accepting that a big fat boy has been born after 2 years of expedition? Only God knows how many soldiers who have gone to the expedition will choose to divorce when they come back. After recent activities, he has become very familiar with the headquarters of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Indian Affairs. The final written instructions are just routine. The reception staff of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs did not use any great principles to express the urgency and importance of going to Europe. These great principles do not need to be told by others. Alan Wilson understands them better than anyone else. He is even more concerned than other colleagues. When he returned to London, he was still receiving the salary of the Hyderabad commissioner given by Ali Khan. It is not good to take money for nothing. Because Germany is not completely calm at present, before the necessary restoration of order, Alan Wilson and other diplomats who represent Britain to establish order in the British occupied areas will not go to any city in Germany as their first stop, but to the French capital of Paris. Judging from the divisions of the Yalta Conference, the British Empire, with its 30 million square kilometers of colonies, was relatively able to stand on equal footing with the United States and the Soviet Union. The British occupied zone consisted of northwestern Germany, including the Ruhr area, Schleswig-Holstein, and southern Austria, including important cities such as Bonn, Hamburg, Cologne, and Kiel. The Ruhr area was Germany's industrial area, and Bonn was later the capital of the Federal Republic of Germany. Hamburg and Kiel were both important ports. A large part of the essence of German industry was in the British occupied zone. It must be admitted that being born in a powerful country always has certain benefits. When Alan Wilson arrived in the British occupied zone, he could search for what he wanted in the Germans' elite industrial areas. The matter was not urgent. Ali Khan's London butler also came to the port to see him off, and waited for the ship to start. Before boarding the ship, Alan Wilson instructed, "Alim, I will contact you after I arrive in Paris and guide you to ship the things you need. If the food shipped from British India arrives, you can go to Burgess." He used to work at the BBC and report the Maharaja's goodwill towards the current devastation in Europe. The BBC is the most suitable. At this time, Alan Wilson did not mind borrowing the connections of the Cambridge 5 members. It was to make money, not to be afraid. After a casual chat, Alan Wilson was notified that the ship was about to set sail, so he said goodbye to Ali Khan's London butler. The ship set off for the other side of the English Channel, and complaints came immediately. Many members who came to take up their posts complained, "Why send planes to send them over? Could they still be shot down in France now? Maybe the foreign minister wants us to see the real situation of the French territory now, so that we can cherish peace more and express enthusiasm for work." Alan Wilson whistled. He knew without thinking that the situation in France was probably only slightly better than that in Germany, where the war had not yet ended. It was probably not much better. "Oh, Alan, maybe what you said makes sense." A foreign representative, F4, nodded in agreement and said exaggeratedly, "As we all know, the French have always been the embodiment of bravery. Of course, I believe they will not surrender a second time." Another foreign representative also joined in. "It seems that the topic of France can always excite the British. Maybe the French will say that it is precisely because they surrendered to the Germans that they did not suffer much loss in the war. Instead of surrendering to reduce losses, why resist? What you said seems to make a lot of sense. Otherwise, the French are smart." Everyone talked one after another, and the air was full of joy, and bursts of laughter broke out from time to time. Alan Wilson couldn't help laughing. Did it enter the part of insulting France so quickly? How can you smear the innocence of the French out of thin air? Alan Wilson thought so, and joined the discussion happily. He must admit that this is a good way to kill time. As soon as the French were mentioned, everyone was no longer sleepy. As for not arranging a plane for them to do it, it was a small matter. A small matter. Crossing the sea and going to Paris by land at this time is far from an easy journey. After landing, everyone wanted to go directly to Paris by rail, but they had to give up this idea. Because many railways have not yet resumed their ability to open to traffic, they had to stop after driving for a while. Fortunately, everyone quickly got help from the British Army in the northern port, so that the appointment did not become a forced march of hunger and cold. Looking around, there were few people, and the traces of the war could still be seen. Just after leaving the port, you can see the fortress set up by the German army. Although the French people are not as frightened as before, they are also in a hurry, indicating that the current situation in France may not be good. The situation in France may be better than that in Germany, but there should not be famine. You know, France is a major agricultural country in Europe, and it also has a place in the world's agricultural hegemony in later generations. Filling their stomachs should not be a problem. Now it is the Germans who are facing the situation of not having enough food. After walking and stopping, when we arrived in Paris, this impressive journey to the post came to an end. Chapter 37 Anglo-French Friendship. Arriving in Paris, the first task for Alan Wilson and other foreign representatives was to divide the occupation zones. At the Yalta Conference, the occupation of Germany in the future was divided into 3 zones by the United States, Britain and the Soviet Union. However, in the subsequent discussions, given that France still had a large colony as support, the Soviet side did not insist too much on the French occupation zone. The first thing for Alan Wilson and other foreign representatives is to talk to the United States and France to discuss the details of the establishment of the French occupation zone and when the occupation forces will officially move in. Although it is believed that the negotiations between the Allied forces and the remaining German armed forces will soon produce results, and Germany's surrender is just a matter of days, there are still big problems in Germany at present, not to mention that some die-hard armed forces are still resisting. The severely damaged land alone cannot sustain the expenses of the occupation forces. This can be seen from the statistics fed back by the frontline soldiers. Alan Wilson and other foreign representatives couldn't help but take a breath when they saw the cold data. 66% of the houses in Cologne were destroyed. 93% of the houses in Dusseldorf were uninhabitable. 80,000 of the 180,000 houses in Frankfurt were destroyed. Of the 5.5 million homes in the British occupied zone, 3.5 million were either completely destroyed or severely damaged. Of the 16 million homes in Germany, 2.34 million were destroyed, and more than 4 million were damaged by at least 25%. When some Allied personnel who had heard reports of the destruction of houses first entered Germany, they were surprised to see so many buildings still standing. In fact, most of them were just shells. There were very few buildings in big cities that were not damaged. In Hanover, less than 1% of the buildings were not damaged. According to the commander of the expeditionary force, 93% of the railways in the British occupied zone allocated to us at the Yalta conference have been damaged. The railways that can be used are less than 1,000 kilometers, and they are not connected to each other, which means they are almost completely unusable. Eiffel raised the document in his hand and placed it in front of Alan Wilson. It's so damaged. You know, the Ruhr area is the heart of German industry. Another foreign representative took a look at the statistics and sighed. It's good that it doesn't become a huge burden. The Germans asked for it. Alan Wilson remained calm. He had no sympathy for the Germans. If they insisted on supporting the great leader to fight for the country, they should be mentally prepared for the current result. When he was a middle school student, he might have been influenced by the handsome uniforms and radical slogans of Germany. Now, forget it. Even from the basic perspective of taking a beating and standing firm, the Germans have nothing to complain about. They are all mature industrial powers and should be responsible for their own choices. It is undeniable that, even if it is for the convenience of the occupying forces, we have to repair the railways, bridges, and infrastructure in the occupied areas. Alan Wilson put the statistical data file aside. Our British occupied area is part of the essence of the German industrial area. The advantage is that there are many remaining processes and machines, which may be helpful to the mainland. The disadvantage is that the British occupied area should have suffered the most tragic air raids by the Allied forces. It is both a wealth and a trouble. Alan, I think the most important reason why the British occupied area was so severely damaged is the deep destruction ordered by Hitler and the German High Command. This actually has little to do with our Allied air raids. Corrected Alan Wilson calmly. We have sufficient evidence to show that the German army is the source of all the difficulties now. That's right. It was done by the Germans themselves, and it has nothing to do with the Allies in the civilized world. Alan Wilson reached out and patted his head, and his attitude changed instantly. He expressed regret for his wrong views with a direct apology. This was of course the result of the Germans' own scorched earth policy. The Great Allied forces strictly enforced iron discipline during the war and did not harm ordinary citizens under any circumstances. Even if there were a few scums, it would not damage the Allied forces' majestic image. Knock, knock, knock. With a knock on the door, a soldier pushed the door open and reported, "Mr. Allen, Mr. Effort, the French liaison has arrived and wants to talk to the foreign representative who just arrived in Paris. We'll be there soon." Effort responded, and his face changed when the soldier left. It must be about communicating with the French occupied areas. These French people always make trouble for us, and we haven't even had a rest. They are all like Charles de Gaulle, who is not strong enough, but unilaterally maintains the so-called dignity of the French people. It's so annoying. But we have no choice but to talk to them. The current situation is rather strange, especially in this kind of post-war cake-sharing negotiations. Our allies' role may not be so fixed. Alan Wilson shrugged and said helplessly, unless we are ready to talk to others without Charles de Gaulle, I guess Stalin will be happy about it. In the current situation in France, who else can we talk to apart from Charles de Gaulle? Of course, it is the largest party in France, the French Communist Party. Except for Charles de Gaulle, no one in France can suppress the French Communist Party. So even if Charles de Gaulle and his supporters show rebelliousness, Alan Wilson has to endure it. Not to mention the foreign representatives who came to France. Even Roosevelt and Churchill have to respect Charles de Gaulle, unless they want to talk to Red France. When facing Charles de Gaulle and his supporters, Britain and the United States have different views. Compared with the Americans, the British really want to help the French, and are more sincere when treating the French. In the final analysis, Britain and France still have huge colonies in their hands. In name, the British Empire still has 30 million square kilometers of colonies around the world, and France also has more than 10 million square kilometers of colonies. In the face of the Soviet Union, which clearly wants to liberate the world, or the United States, which is under the banner of national self-determination, the two outdated overlords of the previous generation should stand on the same front. We have fought many wars with France in the past 900 years, and now we are sitting together again. After leaving the office, Alan Wilson and F4 walked side by side. When they walked out of the building, their faces were already full of smiles. They took the initiative to stretch out their hands and shake hands with the French representatives who came over, and said, "How polite. We just arrived. Our great allies have come to Paris. If we don't hurry, won't the gentlemen be unhappy?" The visitors also responded enthusiastically. The two groups greeted each other, and then returned to the building arm in arm. Chapter 38 The Saharian Problem. The emergence of the French occupied zone was vigorously promoted by Britain, and the war has not officially ended yet. The United States, which is currently the strongest, is not mentally prepared like the world hegemons of later generations. It is still in the dark about how much benefit it will gain from the world in the future. Even Alan Wilson can guess whether the United States is targeting the former world hegemon, the British Empire, or the Soviet Union, which is swallowing up Eastern Europe with a great victory. It is difficult to say. With Britain and France still having a large number of colonies, it is very normal for such hesitation to occur within the US decision-making circle. After all, no one can see the world in a few decades, and policy making is also a step-by-step process. This is also the reason why Churchill vigorously improved the status of France and even urged France to enter the United Nations as a permanent member. To say that they are very optimistic about Charles de Gaulle, neither Britain nor the United States has this intention, but as mentioned before, if they are not optimistic about Charles de Gaulle, no one can suppress the French Communist Party. The French Communist Party has nearly 1 million members, spread across every corner of society, and is the undisputed largest party. Together with their families and friends, their potential power is a huge force in France, which has a population of just over 40 million. As the French representative, the first thing he discussed with Alan Wilson was the expected division of the French occupation zone, and when he could enter the occupation zone. We have to restore a certain post-war order in Germany, right? Otherwise, there is no point in entering. At present, what our two countries and the United States have to do is to maintain basic economic operation in the occupation zone. Alan Wilson crossed his fingers and told his difficulties, otherwise, we will go over and take everything in. Will the soldiers go in to eat grass? Martial law also needs time to restore order. Even the Prime Minister and President Roosevelt can't do anything. Well, when you were still at sea, President Roosevelt had already passed away, and now the President of the United States is Truman. A4, who was next to Alan Wilson, coughed softly and reminded him in a low voice. The principle is still the same. Alan Wilson proved with practical actions that, as long as he didn't feel embarrassed, it was others who were embarrassed. He was still at sea, and had not arrived in London at the time. He didn't know how normal it was that the President of the United States had changed. The French representatives across the table did not pay attention to the movement here, but whispered to each other. Obviously, there were other issues. After a while, Pillemans carefully communicated. In addition to the issue of the time of the march into the French occupied zone, we have another thing. This is also a big voice in the government. If this matter can get the support of Britain, France will be grateful. Peer, please speak. F4 glanced at Alan Wilson and said to the Frenchman across the table in an encouraging voice. On the issue of the Tsar Protectorate, a big voice in the government believes that Germany's potential to start a war should be completely destroyed. This is the opinion of most people. In the matter of the French occupied zone, Britain stands on our side. I believe that our allies will not refuse this matter, Pillamand said, while staring at the reaction of the other party. Alan Wilson looked at each other. This topic was unexpected. He didn't know where the Tsar Protectorate was. F4 asked someone to bring in a map, and the British representative here found the place mentioned by the other party. When World War II just ended, France's attitude towards Germany was exactly the same as that at the end of World War I. Simply put, Germany must die. The main focus of France's post-war punishment of Germany is the treatment of the Saar and Ruhr regions of Germany, and it strongly opposes the establishment of a new German central government. If you can find a suitable template from history, you can find it, which is the state of Germany before unification. The Holy Roman Empire is in the best interests of the French. The Saar region is located on the border between Germany and France, next to the famous Alsace-Lorraine. This place is very small, with less than 2,500 square kilometers, but it has a population of nearly 1 million. More importantly, it has nearly 10 billion tons of coal reserves, and an annual output of tens of millions of tons. Once it is assigned to France, France's production capacity in steel and coal will be comparable to that of pre-war Germany, and the two countries will be on an equal footing in terms of industrial scale. Even France has prepared an excuse. In history, when France was strong, the Holy Roman Empire, the predecessor of Germany, suffered greatly from it. The Saar region had been occupied by France many times. The excuse for occupying the Saar region is that since ancient times. Mr. Peer. Alan Wilson's mind raced, and he quickly organized his words. As we all know, although Britain and France have not always appeared as allies, we have jointly dealt with many war threats in the past 100 years, from the Far East to Crimea, not to mention the two recent world wars. So on the relationship between the two countries, I don't want to say much. It's just that the issue of the Saar region is beyond my current authority. We, the overseas personnel, must submit France's opinions to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then wait for a reply. This is a necessary procedure. As Alan said, this is all necessary. Effort immediately took over and continued, and this problem can be said to be very complicated. The main resistance at present is not London. London and Paris have a friendship cemented by blood, but we don't know what the Americans mean. According to the negotiations of the Yalta Conference, the divisional occupation, including Bavaria in southern Germany all the way to the German-French border, is under the control of the US military. Now the US military controls the places. Even if we want to help, we can't do anything. In the final analysis, we may need to communicate more with the Americans. Alan Wilson finally said in summary, meaning that it is useless to tell us these things. The Saar region is currently occupied by American soldiers. The US military, not the British Army, is responsible for the occupation of the Saar region, and political agitation activities in the region are strictly prohibited. On the other hand, France's position among the Allies after World War II is far inferior to that of France and the Allied powers at the end of World War I. Even if Britain is now trying to prove to the United States and the Soviet Union that France deserves the status of a victorious country, it has little effect. Of course, the problem is not completely unsolvable. The other party just wants to seek the understanding of Britain. Alan Wilson said, it depends on whether General de Gaulle can win over the Saarland during the establishment of the French occupation zone. I understand. Pillamans nodded. The French occupation zone is composed of a piece separated from the British occupation zone and the American occupation zone. The British let France fight for it in this process, and divide the local area into the French occupation zone when the French occupation zone is divided. For Alan Wilson and Effort, they are also happy to push this problem to the Americans, to avoid the jealousy of the Germans. Chapter 39 French Woman. Regarding the French occupied area, our three countries will coordinate, and we will naturally move in at the same time. When we come, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has already put it on record. Alan Wilson informed the French representative and then said, "I believe that, although France is a little depressed now, it will recover quickly. After all, France's foundation is still very good. Agriculture may not seem important in modern society, but it is a fatal problem. If agriculture is stable, a country will not be in chaos. France is precisely an agricultural empire, occupying the best land in Europe. This condition is so superior that both world wars affected a large area of France, but France did not experience a food crisis. If the area of France's mainland was larger, perhaps the United States would stand aside in the international food order." Effort emphasized to the French representatives present, "We in the UK have always expected France to play a greater role in the post-war order, because in a sense, Britain and France must do so. The formal communication on the French-occupied area has ended." Alan Wilson, who knows that the French enjoy exquisite life, left the other party to rest in the representative office and prepared to have a drink. The French are not easy to deal with. It's too difficult to deal with them, even if we have good intentions. Although I also understand that at this time, the only right thing to do is to let the French stand with us. Effort held the wine glass in front of his mouth, his eyes on the French representative, and whispered to Alan Wilson, "There is no other way. We can only keep each other warm. I just hope that the French understand the current predicament of our two countries." Alan Wilson nodded with a stern face, and then walked to the side of the French representative with a gentle smile. Necessary social interaction is necessary. A moment later, Alan Wilson had already arrived in the middle of the French representatives. Although he didn't know much about French politics, he still knew a basic thing. Every country has a group of civil servants. It is most effective to get information from this group, which is also part of Alan Wilson's job. Of course, this can be done through small talk. If there is a topic that the British and French can agree on at present, it is not the division of the occupied areas of Germany, but the colonies. As the former makers of the world order, Britain and France still retain nominally large colonies. The two countries have more than 40 million square kilometers of colonies that have not yet become independent. At the Yalta Conference, Britain became one of the three giants, and then Britain helped France obtain the occupied zone against Germany. All these colonies were the credit. Without colonies, the two former colonial empires of Britain and France would be nothing. Alan Wilson understood this better than anyone else. If Britain did not find a way to hold on to some colonies, it would inevitably become a yes man in a few decades. Only by finding a way to retain some important places could Britain make its own voice. And the countries in the same situation as Britain are not just France, but also the Netherlands, Portugal and even Belgium. Peer. After pouring a glass for Pierlemans, Alan Wilson asked at the same time, "Our two countries are in the same situation now. Before I left British India, I heard that something happened in Vietnam. What do you think of that colony?" During the World War, the French Pétain government surrendered to Germany. In the same year, Japan established a policy of force to advance southward, and the French Vichy government agreed to Japan's stationing of troops in North Vietnam. Japan and France jointly managed Vietnam until this year. However, in March, the Japanese army launched a coup, disarmed the French army, imprisoned Admiral Jean de Gaulle, the Governor-General of the French Indochina Federation, and other French officers, took over the French colonial institutions, and supported Béaudé to come to power. Béaudé then issued a statement announcing the restoration of the independent UNAM, abolished the previously signed Vietnam-France Protection Treaty, and guaranteed cooperation with Japan. When asked about this question, Alan Wilson was of course asking knowingly, and Pierlemans also answered very straightforwardly, "France will not accept any country plundering France's overseas territories for any reason." Oh. This answer is not surprising. Alan Wilson took the initiative to reach out and clink glasses with the other party and said, "I personally respect France's attitude very much, and I hope everything goes well. As colonial empires, France and Britain have different colonial strategies. The British government knows that those lands are colonies, and the French certainly know it in their hearts, but they also believe that the land itself is part of France. This kind of self-talk has been going on since ancient times. Due to the memory of the previous life, Alan Wilson is not unfamiliar with it. It is nothing more than ignoring evidence that is unfavorable to oneself and looking for evidence that is favorable to oneself. Mentioning Vietnam's status, we can know the current understanding of the entire colony within the French government. It is definitely not a casual chat. As long as the French are firm in their current attitude, Alan Wilson believes that there will be plenty of opportunities for cooperation between the two sides in the future. After relaxing for a while, Pillemans and others left the representative office. It was afternoon time, and the streets of Paris seemed to have returned to the peaceful times. It must be admitted that as the originator of modern urban planning, Paris is no less famous than London in the world, and even more famous. The French are famous in literature and art. In other words, they have strong soft power, which has led to many countries having a strong filter for Paris, and even Paris syndrome. The cause of Paris syndrome is a psychological disease caused by the huge difference between the real Paris and their imagination. The Japanese Parisians are elegant in manners, exquisite French food, and luxury goods such as Louis Vuitton bags. When they come to Paris and see the streets full of dog shit, it is inevitable that there will be a psychological gap. To a certain extent, it can be explained in Chinese as being more patriotic after going abroad. It may be that the Japanese themselves are more depressed, so they have a great sense of disappointment. Now that World War II has just ended, Paris is not full of people from the third world. It still looks like old France. Why is there a crowd of people in front? Seeing the car slow down, Alan Wilson asked in confusion. To be honest, Paris is well planned, and there shouldn't be a crowd. Nothing. Pillemans, who was sitting in the front, took a look and answered as if he was not surprised. Alan Wilson had already got out of the car and looked far away. He was so fast that no one else could react. When seeing something eye-catching, men always burst out their potential, such as seeing a woman without clothes, and not just one. More than a dozen women were stripped of their clothes and were being paraded through the streets amid the shouting of the crowd. This is part of the post-war settlement. Oh. Alan Wilson made a strange sound and looked back at Pillemans with a playful look. Chapter 40. What if I insult the law? What's going on? Huh. Wow. Effort got out of the car and understood what was going on in an instant. He restrained his malice and asked knowingly, performance art? Have the French become so open? As a British gentleman, facing the French who are both enemies and friends, Effort could not restrain his desire to insult France. At the same time, the foreign officials of other representative offices got out of the car. With such a good show, how could they leave? Ignoring the good intentions of their French companions who wanted to take them around. That's it. This is good. Alan Wilson took the lead, and a group of British people walked towards the parade crowd. Looking back, they saw that one of the British civil servants accompanying them was carrying a camera. They were immediately furious. Why do you bring a camera? Don't take pictures later. Alan, how could I be that kind of person? The foreign representative who was stopped by Alan Wilson retorted with a serious face. You can't insult a gentleman with such malicious thoughts. Now the gentleman saw that the Parisians were having entertainment activities and wanted to join in. There was nothing wrong with it. Ignoring the obstruction of Pillemans and his group, he stared at these naked French women with vicious eyes to express his indignation against these traitors. In fact, if you think about it carefully, it is not impossible to leave two photos. It was not Alan Wilson's original intention to mingle with the French. When he got off the car at the beginning, he did it because of his male instinct to get off the car and prepare for a good show. He knew in his heart that this was part of the post-war settlement of Western European countries, and it was not just in France. With the surrender of Germany being a foregone conclusion, peace seemed to have seen the dawn. But in fact, after the war, although peace came, Europe did not enter peace. Western Europe launched a movement called the Settlement of Collaborators. This kind of settlement activity with revenge and punishment after the war was staged in various European countries after the war and became the demon of hundreds of thousands of people at that time. In the settlement movement, France, the largest country in Western Europe, was the most intense. During the German occupation of France, a large number of French girls fell in love with German soldiers stationed in France. This was not prohibited, and French men did not protest. However, after the war, these French men who had been speechless ignited a fire of revenge and demanded that these women be punished as collaborators. Alan Wilson, who was squeezed in the crowd, was still in a blank state when he heard a group of French people shouting slogans. Then someone came out with scissors. This shouting also woke Alan Wilson up from his brain freeze. The dozen or so French women in front of him, ranging in age from 20 to 30, had different faces. What they had in common was that their faces were full of tears, their eyes were either empty or desperate, and they were surrounded by excited Parisians. These French women watched the scissors getting closer and closer, but they dared not move, fearing that their evasive behavior would bring greater humiliation. Amid the laughter around him, Alan Wilson suddenly felt that he could not stand this scene, and walked out directly. In full view of the public and the astonishment of the French, he came to these naked women, then took off his shirt and put it on a woman. Who are you, and what is your relationship with these collaborators? Alan Wilson's action immediately made the French people who were watching the excitement explode, spitting and cursing, and several young men rolled up their sleeves, rubbing their hands and ready to take action to show their courage. Effort, let our people take off their shirts. Alan Wilson shouted at his colleagues, not taking the French around him seriously. When they heard that they were not speaking French, the French around him became even more angry. Fortunately, there were civil servants from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who came to France this time who knew French, and they quickly switched languages to prevent Alan Wilson from being beaten up. In this way, a group of British diplomats took off their shirts and put them on the surrounded French women. "Are you British?" one of the women in her early 20s with tears in the corners of her eyes asked. "Of course, gentlemen of the British Empire." Alan Wilson turned his back to the French woman while speaking. Other civil servants of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs followed suit, blocking the French women behind them, looking up at the crowd of people who were eager to watch the show, with arrogance in their eyes. Not only that, before Lemons spoke, Alan Wilson had already shouted, "From now on, this unmanly behavior must be banned. What does it have to do with you British people?" The voice came from somewhere, and the diplomatic civil servant who knew French next to him translated the words. "I don't know who you are, or where you are hiding, but this voice is a man's. I can hear it." Alan Wilson didn't tell who said it. Anyway, it was a Frenchman, and he shouted unceremoniously, "There is a saying that war keeps women away, but in fact, the fate of women in war is even more tragic. To be fair, in times of war, no matter which government, they will give priority to taking care of men, because men have to fight on the battlefield." At this point, Alan Wilson suddenly woke up. Why can't he change his professional habits? He started to talk about the same things again in such an occasion. "After losing the war, what do you want these women to do? Of course, we do not deny being with the invaders, and most of the glorious French citizens cannot stand it." Alan Wilson, who had come to his senses, accused righteously, "Remember this shame in your heart to prevent it from happening again in the future, instead of humiliating the women of your own country after the war. I believe that, if these women have any other way, they don't want to get involved with the invaders. They are victims, but now they have to endure your humiliation. You are all French, citizens of the same country." It was not a resounding remark, but because Alan Wilson and his people were British diplomats who came to Paris, Lemons immediately started to drive away the citizens who were watching the excitement around them, and the crowds around them surged. "You are such a compassionate person, I didn't expect it." As the crowd around him dispersed, F4 came over and lowered his voice. "Look at Pierre's face, how ugly it is. If I had known, I would have said a few words just now. Why can't you forget to insult France?" Alan Wilson rolled his eyelids, turned around and looked at these French women with their heads down, and instantly changed his mind. What if it was insulting France? If there were levels for insulting France, Alan Wilson was obviously at a high level. He thought that the Sun would definitely like this kind of news, and it would not be a problem for it to occupy the BBC's pages. Chapter 41 Heading to Berlin. If Alan Wilson had his own choice, he would still like this kind of report to appear in the Sun. This kind of news is very consistent with the style of the Sun. Everyone knows that the readers of the Sun never care who is governing the country. As long as the photos reported are smooth and big, it will not hinder the wide audience of the Sun. Commissioner Alan Khan also accepted to appear in the BBC newspaper because the whole of Europe was filled with a sense of dejection during the two world wars. This social environment is also the origin of white leftism and finally formed political correctness. A British diplomatic civil servant in the French capital of Paris spoke out and denounced the shamelessness of the French. This is definitely a big news worth reporting for the BBC. It is tough that the homeland was not occupied by Germany. Now the British can stand on the moral high ground and speak loudly to accuse France and even the entire Western European countries of persecuting their female citizens. The crowd dispersed, and Alan Wilson and other British diplomatic officials put their coats on the French women. The number was a little insufficient, and they were not polite. They borrowed some from Pillemans and other French representatives. These women were all French. Would it be appropriate for you French representatives not to make a contribution? Alan Wilson, who had just taken on the task of rescuing fallen women, took out some pounds and said in a gentle voice, "Find a place to fill your stomach first. If you have any problems, our representative office is not difficult to find. If you have any difficulties, you can speak directly. The war is over." Click. A slight sound suddenly appeared, and the camera in the hand of the British diplomat recorded this scene. Alan Wilson was still being sentimental, saying with pictures and texts, "In the final analysis, you are also victims of the war. In this regard, some, and a small number of citizens of this country are indeed not generous enough. We British are firmly opposed to this. We will communicate with the French government on this matter, and we will also mediate with the Netherlands, Belgium and the countries invaded by Germany. I believe that such incidents will be reduced a lot in the future." A British civil servant comforted the French woman in a gentle voice, and the French women who were stripped naked around her were crying, which was heartbreaking. Except for the camera shutter sound that was a little inappropriate, everything else was fine. At the performance time, Alan Wilson did not pay attention to such minor flaws. After all, it was not acting that could be overturned. It must be said that people who do diplomatic work are all potential qualified spies. Some people kept taking pictures to record, and others took out paper and pen to record. Alan Wilson was full of the atmosphere of the Virgin Mary. In fact, it was easy to talk without any pain. Anyway, the British mainland had not fallen. Finally, Alan Wilson asked the representative office to send these poor French women back with their cars, and told them that, if they had any difficulties, they could come to them, and left their addresses before the matter came to an end. After all this, the gentlemen of the British Empire, including Alan Wilson, felt relieved. The two colleagues who took notes and took photos said that they would send the photos and records back to the country immediately. Britain's post-war public opinion hegemony still exists temporarily. As early as the 19th century, the French Havas news agency, the German Wolf news agency, and the British Reuters developed into international news agencies with the support of their respective governments. There was fierce competition among the news agencies. They have basically divided up the world news market. In order to confirm the established facts and their respective monopoly scope, Reuters, Havas and Wolf held a reconciliation meeting in Paris and signed the monopoly agreement, the Ring Alliance, to divide the world news market. Later, the United States rose, and the Americans had a share of public opinion hegemony. Although the Ring Alliance no longer exists in name, in addition to the German defeat that affected German public opinion, there is also a new enemy, the Soviet TASS. Britain still has influence on European public opinion. This is of course a good opportunity to promote British gentlemanly manners. However, because Alan Wilson was in Paris, he did not know for the time being that his image in the Sun was fixed in the photo of him giving pounds to a French woman, which looked like a flesh trade. The style of the picture on the BBC was much more normal. Seizing an opportunity to promote the positive image of Britain, local newspapers published a series of articles reporting on Britain's efforts to restore peace in Europe and eliminate hatred. Germany surrendered. When he got up the next day and was handling official business, the representative office suddenly rang out thunderous cheers. Alan Wilson also howled twice. Everyone was venting their emotions, and it would be inappropriate for him to be too lazy to respond. Starting from the day Hitler committed suicide, Donitz tried to keep the Soviet Union in peace under the premise of maintaining the army, but was rejected. Then he tried to negotiate with the West and proposed that the Southern German army surrender first, but was rejected by Eisenhower. After that, he proposed to surrender to the West alone in order to continue fighting the Soviet Union, which was also rejected. Eisenhower threatened to continue the war and block the front line. At this point, Germany had no other choice but to surrender unconditionally. Even outside the window, the cheers of Parisians could be heard faintly. Although France's contribution to the war was small, it did not stop them from cheering for the victors. I remember that Eisenhower seemed to be the descendant of German immigrants. Alan Wilson whispered to his partner, Eva, in a teasing tone, "This shows that converts are more terrible than ordinary enemies." London asked us to rush to Berlin immediately to record the process of formal surrender. Domestic newspapers may be faster than us and have already flown there. Eva packed up his things and nodded at Alan Wilson. "My God, the busy work has just begun. But I haven't read these materials yet. They were just delivered." Alan Wilson pointed to the documents on the table. "Take them with you and read them on the way." Eva shrugged, unable to help. This time, these humble social tools belonging to Britain finally had the qualification to take a plane. This was also related to the fact that the railway network in Germany was completely unusable. It was impossible for the Allied leaders to wait for a group of dedicated civil servants to arrive at the surrender ceremony, right? On the plane to Berlin, when Alan Wilson flew over the Ruhr area, he happened to see a dense crowd of prisoners of war being held together. "Where are we?" Alan Wilson asked the crew of the plane. "Over the Rhine." Alan Wilson nodded indifferently after getting the answer. So what he just saw should be the Rhine camp. He couldn't say he sympathized with them. He believed that these brave German soldiers had thought of the worst outcome before going to the battlefield. They were brave and fearless Germans. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 42, Symbols of Civil Servants. With a dull sound, the military plane that had been hovering over Berlin for a long time finally landed successfully, which made Alan Wilson, who was pale, feel relieved. He had even imagined the scene of the military plane being shot down by the German armed forces that did not surrender, or the Soviet Red Army's anti-aircraft guns, but finally everything was safe. "Why do you look so bad?" Effort had already stood up, and seeing Alan Wilson, who was still in shock, he couldn't help but tease. "It seems that we don't take a plane when we go to France, which is just right for you. It's far from safe now. We all know that 9 out of 10 air defenses are shot down. Even if the air defense forces are well prepared, no more than 5% of the bombers will be shot down each time, but this will not delay the bomber pilots from surviving for more than 3 months, because the air raids are not just one time." Alan Wilson took a few breaths to calm down and sighed that flying was still to be avoided, and then he dragged 2 heavy suitcases off the plane. Because of the Battle of Berlin, the entire city of Berlin was full of ruins. Although some of them had been urgently cleaned up, it was only a good thing. Many tall buildings seemed to fall down with a slight push, and their shapes were like Picasso's abstract paintings that were difficult to understand. The British soldiers who greeted them in Berlin, Alan Wilson and the other 8 people, had found a place to rest. There were British soldiers' barracks around, so safety was not a problem. "What's the situation in Berlin now?" Alan Wilson asked the commander of the unit, who shrugged and said, "In fact, we have just arrived for a day and are not familiar with many things. But we have been very welcomed. The residents of Berlin seem to be frightened by the Soviets. Let's not sympathize with them. Who asked them to start the war and lose it? The Soviets should treat them as they please." Alan Wilson chuckled. He was a person who lacked sympathy. He could pretend in Paris, even if France was a suspicious ally, but he didn't need to pretend in Berlin. In the atmosphere of victory at the end of the war on the European battlefield, at least in the short term, it was politically correct to severely punish Germany from top to bottom. As for the future, we will talk about it later. Why were Berliners afraid of Soviet soldiers? Everything had a reason. Just look at what German soldiers did in the Soviet Union. It was reasonable for the Soviet Red Army to attack Berlin for bloody revenge. Some German bastards in later generations deliberately blamed the SS for the crime. It was completely bullshit. Have all the SS soldiers been to the Soviet Union? How did they cause more than 10 million civilian casualties in the Soviet Union when there were only 200,000 combat troops? Even if the Soviet Union killed all 20 million Germans in the occupied areas and made them disappear from the world, he would have no objection. This is a temporary residence. We will notify you to move there after we clean up the residential area. After sending Alan Wilson to the place, the British lieutenant saluted and left. Wait. Alan Wilson took out a box of cigarettes from his pocket and handed it to the other party as a thank you. Thank you so much. The lieutenant was overjoyed when he saw it. Now Berlin is short of supplies, not to mention cigarettes. This gift is really a pleasant surprise, and he accepted it with a smile. The German mark is already a piece of waste paper because order has collapsed and the banknotes of any country are implicated. Now the most valuable thing in Germany is no longer money, but cigarettes. In Germany, which has long been destroyed, cigarettes come out of nowhere. One cigarette can ensure that a person can eat and drink for a day. At that time, a large number of male laborers in the country were captured, and German women were also quite worthless. 2 cigarettes could be exchanged for a woman. Not long after, the temporary residents welcomed a group of guests. They were reporters from major British newspapers who came to witness the German surrender ceremony. Many people did not want to miss the historic scene and flew from London. When someone saw Alan Wilson himself, his face became strange. Isn't this the diplomat who was reprinted by major domestic newspapers and had sex with French women on the streets of Paris? However, although not all of them are in the photo, there are several naked French women with good figures. Gentlemen, what's wrong with you? Alan Wilson asked with a stern face, unable to bear the strange gaze. He didn't know that he had become the most famous civil servant in the UK and had a wide range of national popularity. The photo of handing money to the Parisian woman has become a classic image representing the British Empire's civil service system. It's okay. We are just curious about Mr. Allen. One of the reporters wanted to ask how Alan Wilson was photographed buying prostitutes on the streets of Paris and whether he was really photographed buying prostitutes. But he thought that asking directly was not gentlemanly, so he decided to find an opportunity to ask privately later. Many reporters asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs if there was a specific process, and Alan Wilson said that he was also waiting for notification. When asked about the Soviet Union's destruction of Berlin, Alan Wilson said with a serious face, "The Soviet Union and we are allies at present. In such a victory, it is not appropriate to have an open conflict." As a diplomat with correct values, Alan Wilson stated a clear position. He can be hypocritical to anyone, but not to the Germans. This is a matter of principle. As for revenge, we in the UK do not retaliate against ordinary people. This is because we British people are gentlemanly, and it is an honorable thing. However, if other countries want to vent their anger because of the invasion, this is understandable. Alan Wilson praised his motherland and finally emphasized, there is also a trivial reason. The Soviet Union is not easy to mess with. It costs money to uphold justice. The reporters all showed a look of understanding. They all agreed that for the sake of the unity among the Allies, they should not make trouble at this time. Professional ethics cannot let them ignore the overall situation at such a grand victory ceremony. If you had said earlier that we can't afford to mess with the Soviet Union, wouldn't everyone understand? Why do you have to say that nonsense? In the midst of a happy atmosphere, the reporters from the UK said goodbye one after another. Alan Wilson also began to open the suitcase, but he took the wrong one and opened the suitcase full of cigarettes. He looked around like a thief, quickly pushed the suitcase back, and opened another similar suitcase. There were a lot of things in this suitcase. In addition to half a box of cigarettes and a change of clothes, there were only documents that he hadn't had time to read. Work is still important. Alan Wilson took out a document that he had not had time to read on the way from Paris and opened it. He frowned and muttered, Yugoslav Fatherland Army, marginalized people in World War II. Chapter 43 Balkan Savior. Oh, Alan, you are reading the documents. The military has prepared food. F4 pushed open the door and saw Alan Wilson reading the documents. He came closer and saw that it was a report on the Balkan Peninsula. He sighed. When did you become so energetic? Are all civil servants in British India like this? That's not the case. Alan Wilson laughed and flipped through the Balkan report and shook his head slightly. I should have read it in Paris, but I was delayed because I came to Berlin. This is quite troublesome. How to treat these armed forces? Some foreign ministries in London have a headache. This is a considerable force. While speaking, Alan Wilson unconsciously pushed the file bag with one hand. This force is one of the sequelae of the war. It is said that the composition of the Yugoslav Fatherland Army is actually quite complicated, and it has different tendencies at different stages. Before the official outbreak of the World War, Britain and France certainly did not simply appease. In many European countries, there were forces supported by Britain and France to compete with Germany. Britain and France, as vested interests, fought with Germany in World War I. Although they were still able to suppress the United States after the war, they knew in their hearts that both countries needed time to recover. But Germany did not give them any chance at all. When facing the threat of war, Britain and France could not help but look ahead and behind. On the one hand, they built a siege against Germany, hoping to deter the Germans, and did not want to see bloodshed like in World War I. Before they met on the battlefield, the struggle between Britain and Germany unfolded at the diplomatic level. When the war broke out, the ruling principal of Yugoslavia was afraid that the Axis powers would attack Yugoslavia, so he signed the Tripartite Pact and agreed to cooperate with Germany and Italy. As a result, large-scale demonstrations took place in the capital Belgrade. 2 days later, King Peter II, with the support of Britain, launched a military coup and overthrew the prince's regime. General Dusan Simovi became prime minister. At this time, Yugoslavia was in a very embarrassing position. In fact, it no longer supported the Axis powers, but it did not formally withdraw from the Tripartite Pact. The new government opposed Germany, but was afraid that, if it was invaded, Britain would not be able to help, and finally the Axis powers began to invade. The Yugoslav Fatherland Army was mainly composed of Serbs and Montenegrins. They were loyal to the Yugoslav royal family and repeatedly resisted Italy's rule in Montenegro, but were suppressed by the Italian army. Therefore, they were supported by Britain, and regarded as the Allied forces. King Paul II of Yugoslavia is now in exile in London. Logically, the Yugoslav Fatherland Army is the same as the anti-German forces in many European countries before the war, which is a pro-British force. But this is not the case. In addition to the Yugoslav Fatherland Army, there are other forces in Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia was a victorious country after World War I, because it defeated the Allied powers. The Serbs occupied the land of other ethnic groups. In today's Yugoslavia, Serbs account for only a little more than 40% and are not a dominant ethnic group. Some people in later generations attributed the disintegration of Yugoslavia to the result of suppressing the Serbian main ethnic group. In fact, this is not the case. Serbs have never been the majority population of this country. Croats and Slovenes are pro-German, and they and the Yugoslav Fatherland Army constitute Tito's opposition. The Yugoslav Home Army, which is now composed of pro-German and pro-British factions, has withdrawn from Yugoslavia and headed for the Allied occupied areas. In fact, we can imagine that the final decision London may make is to abandon them. Ford looked at Alan Wilson at a loss, guessing London's final decision. Maybe the decision will not be made so soon. After all, now it is mainly Germany's surrender ceremony. Is it, just like we exchanged the security of Greece for the Polish government in exile in London to get out and hand Poland over to the Soviet Union? Alan Wilson chuckled and said self-deprecatingly, at the Yalta conference, it is understandable to make such an exchange condition. The Prime Minister has tried his best to maintain Britain's presence in Europe. Both the United States and the Soviet Union are powerful negotiating opponents. Rationally, we can't keep Poland, so we might as well exchange it for Greece's security. I dare to conclude that once this still expanding royalist force falls into Tito's hands, they will all be killed. Alan Wilson looked at Ford with a heavy heart and gave his own assertion. According to the Soviet thinking, this is considered a class enemy, which is a terrible definition. The most important thing is that Alan Wilson does not want to sell out other countries for Britain and let the interests be occupied by the United States. Britain sold out Poland and saved Greece with great efforts. The opposition is still pro-Soviet, and the government will become pro-American. Britain has nothing to do with it. If Britain gets moral praise, it would be better to let the Americans deal with it. Although Britain sold out Poland, it had nothing to do with Alan Wilson after all. However, the Balkan report was in his hands. He knew that, if he pretended not to see it, and directly fed back to London, the Yugoslav Homeland Army that had gathered in the Allied occupied zone would inevitably be liquidated by Tito, and the death toll would be calculated in hundreds of thousands. Now the lives of these Yugoslav royalists, Croats, and Slovenes are in the hands of Alan Wilson. Alan, in fact, we are out of reach. According to the opinions of the Yalta Conference, the British occupation zone is in the northwest of Germany, including the southern part of Germany including Bavaria. The American occupation zone is from the French border to Austria. There are British diplomats nearby, but no British troops are stationed. F4 shrugged helplessly, this is a fact. Occupying the northwest coast of Germany including the Ruhr area is a victory in the diplomatic field. Aren't the Americans always dissatisfied? Alan Wilson smiled indifferently. I don't know who the current chief executive of Bavaria is. I know that. It's a general named Patton. F4 spoke easily, and then was startled. Why did this colleague jump up so quickly? When did he jump up? Alan Wilson's face became very interesting, and his mind turned quickly. Oh, it's General Patton. Alan, what's wrong with you? F4 pointed to the Balkan report in Alan Wilson's hand and asked, in fact, there is no need to be too impatient. The most important thing now is the surrender ceremony. Yes, I agree. Alan Wilson collected the document and agreed. He would not hand over the Balkan report to London first. That's it. Alan Wilson has seen some hope for solving the problem of the forgotten people of World War II, although he cannot guarantee success. But he feels that he has tried his best and will not be worse than history. If the governor of Bavaria is not Patton, this matter will be really difficult and there will be no hope. I will write slowly, because I have never written about this period before. When I wrote about the Soviet Union, it started in 1953. Europe must come, and the paragraph about British India is not as important as this side of Europe. Chapter 44 Germany surrenders. Under the current circumstances, neither the United States nor Britain is willing to provoke the Soviet Union at this time. Tito of Yugoslavia happens to be a Soviet subordinate force in the eyes of the two countries. It is definitely not accidental that the Yugoslav Fatherland Army, which was supported by Britain before, was abandoned. After all, for Britain, this kind of thing is not the first time. The Polish government in exile in London has been sold once, and it is no big deal to sell the Yugoslav Fatherland Army again. But for Alan Wilson, this is hundreds of thousands of lives after all. After the repatriation of these Yugoslav Fatherland Army alone, as many as more than 100,000 people were purged. For these marginal groups in World War II, the future fatists took rule. The direct reason is that the British Empire did not do things properly. Knowing what the fate of these people was, and because Britain was at fault, Alan Wilson was indeed thinking of ways to see if there was any way to save these people. Hearing that the chief executive of Bavaria was Patton, Alan Wilson felt that there was no way out. 4-star General Patton. This name is also famous in later generations. For Patton, it is best that the war will never end. Like Churchill, Patton's hostility to the Soviet Union is also very obvious. The difference is that Churchill came secretly, while Patton has even begun to prepare for war with the Soviet Union. The end of the World War means that Patton's path to realize the value of life has come to an end. If the Soviet-American War breaks out, then continuing to command the US military to march eastward, gaining higher honors, and stepping into the peak of his military career will all be logical. It is better to say that he is considering himself, rather than considering two countries, two nations, and two political systems. If there is a way to connect the Yugoslav Fatherland Army with Patton, who is currently in charge of Bavaria, Alan Wilson believes that Patton is likely to agree to these Tito opponents and temporarily take them in Bavaria. Because Patton's pure military thinking can make such a decision. What is needed is that someone arranges for the leaders of the Yugoslav Fatherland Army to meet General Patton in the middle. As evening approached, diplomats such as Alan Wilson moved to a quieter place to live and worked all night to prepare for the second surrender ceremony the next day. They had received news that Field Marshal Montgomery and 5-star General Eisenhower would attend. British diplomats who were preparing documents for the formal surrender complained about the Soviet Union's excess of behavior. The Germans surrendered once, but the Soviets are asking them to surrender a second time. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Kremlin is dissatisfied with the last surrender. Alan Wilson flipped through the documents and said helplessly, the Soviets and Germans fought bloody battles for several years, but they were ignored in the surrender, so it is reasonable to protest. In Reims, a small town in northeastern France, a signing ceremony for Germany's unconditional surrender had been held. At that time, the German government sent General Jodl as the signing representative, under the protest of the Soviet Union, in order to maintain the unity among the Allies in World War II, avoid the embarrassment of tearing their faces apart just after defeating Germany, and also expect the Soviet Red Army to help the United States solve Japan. The British and American Allied forces and the Soviet side reached an agreement and decided to hold another surrender ceremony in Berlin the next day, hosted by the Soviet Union. This surrender ceremony was indeed much more grand, and both sides sent almost the highest level officials to attend. The documents have been prepared, and the surrender ceremony will be held tomorrow. It will definitely be very lively. The Soviets will definitely make the scene very grand. Alan Wilson stretched and yawned. You talk as if you know the Soviet Union very well. F4 smiled disdainfully. We should let Mi-6 check you. This joke is not funny. Alan Wilson spoke solemnly. There are indeed spies in Britain now, even in Mi-6. The next morning, Alan Wilson and other diplomats got up early, not to go to the Berlin market, to find German fallen women who could be saved, but to meet with Air Force General Ted. General Ted was the representative who signed on behalf of Britain at the surrender ceremony. Although Montgomery and Eisenhower were confirmed to attend, they only came to express the unity among the Allies, because they had already signed once before, so there was someone else who signed to accept Germany's surrender this time. Representatives of various countries drove to Karlshorst, a suburb of Berlin. Along the way, cars with national flags were shuttling through the city of Berlin. On the corners of the streets, countless Berlin citizens secretly watched the victors' show of force, with complicated feelings in their hearts. Look, they look pitiful now. If they were in the same place, they would definitely not be like this. Alan Wilson tilted his head and said to his colleagues, think about how they humiliated the French a few years ago. Everything has a reason. When they left the city, both sides of the road were occupied by soldiers of the Soviet Red Army. Just like what Alan Wilson said, how to make a scene grand. The Soviet Union really has such a talent. The surrender site was already crowded with people and surrounded by Soviet officers and soldiers. The surrender representatives of the United States, Britain and France got off the car one after another and saluted these Soviet Red Army officers and soldiers. The venue immediately burst into cheers. Reporters from various countries seized the opportunity to take pictures, and the sound of shutters kept recording this scene that showed the unity of the Allies and maintained world peace. Under the chairmanship of Soviet Marshal Zhukov, the ceremony called the formal surrender began. Zhukov read out the requirements of unconditional surrender on behalf of the Soviet Union. When the German representative, Marshal Keitel, led the German delegation to the signing hall, he raised the scepter and saluted the representatives of the Allies in a polite manner. Compared with the surrender ceremony of the Allied forces on the Western Front, the Soviets were obviously much more stringent, but the French representative General Drancy appreciated this move. 5 years ago, Marshal Keitel, who now surrendered on behalf of Germany, was the German representative at the French surrender ceremony at that time, not to mention the famous Foch carriage humiliation. Things change over time. War is a winner-takes-all game. General Drancy will represent France today, together with the United States, Britain and the Soviet Union, to witness Germany's unconditional surrender. Air Force General Ted representing Britain, General Drancy representing France and General Spaatz, commander of the US Strategic Air Force, signed the surrender document with Soviet Marshals Zhukov under the witness of Montgomery and Eisenhower. All around, countless officers and soldiers shouted loudly for the hard-won peace. Montgomery and Eisenhower stepped forward and took photos with Soviet Marshals Zhukov to celebrate Germany's formal surrender. I'm also a witness to history, although there is no place for me. Alan Wilson pinched his waist and watched this scene, and he was also happy about the end of the war. Chapter 45 Disappointed Patton. The Little Commissioner's complaints did not hinder the united, victorious and harmonious surrender ceremony. All the Allied leaders were happy and enjoying the joy of victory. As for the celebration location in Berlin, the capital of Germany, this was just a small problem. Eisenhower also brought a gift for Marshals Yukov of the Soviet Red Army, a truck full of Coca-Cola. Eisenhower, holding Coca-Cola in his hand, opened it in front of Zhukov and handed it to him. Dear Marshal, at such a special moment, we sincerely wish you good health, and the friendship between the United States and the Soviet Union can be maintained forever. The war is not over yet. The Japanese in the Far East are still unwilling to accept this great victory. The United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics will continue to fight. General Eisenhower, thank you. Marshal Zhukov took the Coca-Cola handed over by the other party very readily and drank it directly, looking very comfortable. Obviously, this was not the first time he tasted this drink. In fact, Coca-Cola Company has made another adjustment to its personalized products. The company produced colorless white cola at the request of a very special consumer, who happened to be a well-known Soviet general. This person was Marshal Zhukov. One of the biggest fans of cola was Eisenhower. He was not only responsible for providing supplies to the US Army, but also recommended cola to the famous Soviet Marshal Zhukov for the first time. This time Eisenhower came to Berlin and happened to bring 50 boxes of Coca-Cola to Marshal Zhukov. Because the Soviet Union had a ban on Coca-Cola, no one could buy more than 50 boxes of Coke for the first time. Eisenhower's move was also to comply with the ban and establish a friendly personal relationship with Marshal Zhukov. Others at the surrender ceremony also shared the American drink with the help of Marshal Zhukov. Look how happy the Soviets are drinking. Eiffel also held a bottle of Coke and said, it seems that it is not impossible to touch it. This is not the People's Cola. Alan Wilson almost couldn't help laughing. The People's Cola was a joke during the Soviet period. Because Pepsi was suppressed by Coca-Cola and couldn't raise its head, it thought of opening up a market without Coca-Cola. Is there such a market? Of course there is. That is, the Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries influenced by the Soviet Union. Therefore, every year during the October Revolution, Pepsi promoted in the Soviet Union and denounced Coca-Cola as the spokesperson of imperialism. Pepsi is the cola that belongs to the proletariat and the people. Let's see if we can hold a military parade in Berlin. When Berlin is initially cleared, our four countries will hold a military parade in Berlin to show unity. Marshal Zhukov proposed to the generals including Eisenhower. I don't know how you feel. Well, I agree with this. Eisenhower heard Zhukov's words and thought a lot at once, but did not refuse. The other British and French generals present, including Montgomery and General Drancy, did not object. In fact, they did not fail to think that, if a joint military parade of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain and France was held in Berlin, the protagonist would of course be the Soviet Red Army, which was heavily armed near Berlin, and the armies of the United States, Britain and France were destined to be supporting roles. But this is another opportunity to directly observe the Soviet Red Army. On the surface, everyone can parade together to show unity. In secret, they can also evaluate the combat effectiveness of the imaginary enemy. Marshal Zhukov's proposal was unanimously agreed for many reasons. On the streets of Berlin, American soldiers and Soviet Red Army soldiers shook hands to express friendship. British soldiers crossed the road under the command of Soviet female soldiers. Soldiers from various countries stood together to take pictures. At least at this time, most people thought that the war was finally over. In this unforgettable war, they survived. After the final commemoration, they could go home and reunite with their families at home and forget the damn cruel battlefield. This is a demonstration of the Soviets against us. Of course, not all people think so. In Munich, the center of Bavaria, a city famous for the Munich conspiracy, Patton, the commander of the US Third Army, a 4-star general, was furious just a few days after becoming the chief executive of Bavaria. His vulgar words were unbearable to watch. We should attack the Soviet Union now, so that the whole world will be controlled by the United States and its friends. This is a feat that has never happened in history. I don't know what Eisenhower is hesitating about now. He is giving coke to the Soviets. It's a joke. Commander, the war is over. Peace is hard won. General Patton's chief of staff looked helpless. It was not the United States that hated the Soviet Union. On the contrary, most generals had some hostility towards the Soviet Union. Even the 5-star General Eisenhower was not as friendly to the Soviet Union as he seemed on the surface. It was indeed very rare for a senior general like General Patton to not conceal his intentions at all. To be a senior general, you must learn to conceal your true intentions, right? But there are exceptions to everything. General Patton was just a senior general who was unwilling to do so. In my eyes, this is just a half-finished war, and the real enemy has not been eliminated. Patton sighed indignantly. Well, maybe I'm too pessimistic. Japan hasn't surrendered yet, right? I can go to the Far East. The chief of staff pretended not to hear this nostalgia for the war, believing that Patton would eventually figure it out. The four-nation joint military parade is scheduled to be held next month. Alan Wilson is writing a report to London under the lights. The report analyzes the current situation in Europe and asserts that before Japan surrenders, the hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union will not be so obvious. He knows that this report will definitely pass through MI6, and it is a high probability event that Philby will see it. As for the forces in Yugoslavia that opposed Tito, he used ambiguous language to pass it over, emphasizing that the joint military parade will be the main venue of the Soviet Red Army, but there is such an opportunity to evaluate the combat effectiveness of the Soviet Red Army at close range, which should not be missed. Putting down the pen, Alan Wilson put away the report. Now he is thinking of a suitable reason to go to Munich. It is best not to go there on your own initiative, but wait for local things to be handled by someone, and then go there helplessly. It seems that this is a difficult thing, but it is not difficult. The refugees of the Yugoslav Home Army have already poured into the border. When the next report comes in, he can go with the flow and be sent there helplessly. Chapter 46 Allen Report. For the British media who came to witness the surrender ceremony, they will not leave Berlin for the time being. Now everyone knows that a joint military parade of 4 countries will be held next month. This is another big news. Berlin has a reason to be stationed. Although the 4 countries are allies on the surface, compared with the Soviet Red Army, the United States, Britain and France are still roughly on the same side. It is also very important to establish effective public opinion guidance in Berlin. Of course, these reporters stationed in Berlin who have been sent by major newspapers and even Alan Wilson himself know it. It is a little late to guide public opinion. The elite forces of the Soviet People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs have dug deep into the Soviet-occupied areas and searched for German military scientists whose names are listed in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. All this even kept the Americans who have not yet acted in the dark. They did not know that their secret actions had been seen by the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs and were closely watching every move. On the streets of London, reports about Germany's formal surrender filled the London citizens who were already a little tired of the war with enthusiasm. The British Empire finally won this world war and trampled the old rival Germans under its feet. In celebration of the victory over the old enemy, the London government also relaxed its control. Almost instantly, London was lifted from the wartime state. In this celebratory atmosphere, Philby came to his friend's house in casual clothes. "Oh, Philby, it's very lively outside now, right?" Donald MacLean was not surprised at all. While talking, Francis Burgess came out from the inner room and nodded at Philby. "Oh, celebrating the surrender of the Germans is something worth letting go for most people." Philby snorted and threw the documents in his hand on the table. "What is this?" Burgess frowned and looked at the document bag on the table. "I just received it too. The document sent from Berlin to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs." Philby shrugged and said to Donald, "In fact, even if I don't take it, you should see it right away. According to the procedure, it will be sent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs tomorrow, after we finish checking it." Donald MacLean, born in 1915. He has served as a British diplomatic official in France, the United States, Egypt and other countries. MacLean's father was a Scottish man born in England, a politician of the Liberal Party, and had served as the chairman of the Education Committee. At the age of 20, Maclean stepped into the door of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the first time. From then on, he became the first person among the Cambridge Five to penetrate the core of the British regime. Is it a written report sent back from Berlin? Let me see. Donald Maclean was immediately interested when he heard Philby say this, and he started to read it, and soon he was fully immersed in it. What's wrong? Let me see. Burgess saw Alan Wilson's name at a glance, and looked at Philby with a strange look. Is he a symbol of our British Empire civil servants? But, Philby, you seem to pay attention to him. If Alan Wilson knew that giving money to French women on the streets of Paris would have such a great influence, he might consider resigning from his public office at the appropriate time, joining the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, and conducting election activities, and maybe he would become the Prime Minister of the British Empire. With his current fame, it's hard not to be noticed. Moreover, he was so young, but he was taken care of by General Mountbatten. He was the Hyderabad Commissioner in British India, and went to Germany to gain experience after returning. How could I not pay attention to him? Philby said that it was not his fault, and then changed the subject. You all have experience working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Take a good look at the things on it. Burgess stretched out his hand to signal to be patient, and took the document to read it. The document in front of the three people was written by Alan Wilson, which briefly mentioned the Yugoslav Fatherland Army. Except for the Yugoslav Fatherland Army in the Balkans, the rest of the content was not only not mentioned briefly, but also very detailed. In Alan Wilson's report, he first criticized the Soviet Union for the possibility of threatening world peace and turning people in the free world into puppets of the Soviet Union. After a brief political correctness, he analyzed the situation of the Soviet Union from the perspective of imperialism. With the current combat effectiveness of the Soviet Red Army, after 4 years of bloody battles with Germany, the Allied forces on the Western Front may not be the opponent of the Soviet Red Army on the ground, but they can influence the Soviet-occupied areas through certain means. Britain, the United States, France, especially the United States, has the economic strength to do so. It is not surprising that the imperialist tone is hostile to the Soviet Union. Donald and Burgess also nodded secretly, and then said that the American, British, and French occupation zones could use their strong economic power to influence the Soviet-occupied zones. Up to the current paragraph, everything is still normal, but the last paragraph reads, the Soviet Union occupies nearly half of the land in Eurasia. Once it becomes powerful, it will be difficult to contain. After the baptism of the World War, the Allies are unable to match it in terms of the army, and must use superficial easing actions to confine the Soviet Union. Under the premise of maintaining the current status quo in Europe, the possible weak link is not in Europe, but in Asia. Based on my experience in British India, the combat effectiveness of the Japanese army is no longer comparable to that of 4 years ago. Not to mention facing the army on the European battlefield. Even facing the British Indian Army in British India is very difficult. Once the Soviet Union transfers the Soviet Red Army in Europe to Asia, with the current military strength of the Asian allies, it is likely that they will not be able to compete with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is not good at navy, but it does not need a large navy to cross between Sakhalin Island and Hokkaido. What's more, the Japanese combined fleet has been completely lost. The Soviets can land, even if they make a bathtub. Once they land, the old, weak and sick in Japan will definitely not be the opponent of the Soviet Red Army. Once the Soviet Red Army occupies Hokkaido, the fragile Far East environment will be greatly changed. If Hokkaido is in the hands of the Allies, the whole of Japan will be the front line of the Allies to blockade the Soviet Union. If Hokkaido falls into the hands of the Soviet Union, it will in turn become the front line of Japan's core area. Even if the troops are stationed in Japan, Britain and the United States will not be safe. What do you think? Do you think it's a fantasy? Philby looked at his friend and paused for a while waiting for a reply. It's definitely not a fantasy. On the contrary, I find it hard to believe that this is an administrative civil servant from the colony. I believe you that he has worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for many years. Burgess frowned and said solemnly, but what about the analysis of Japan? I checked. He is a student of the Oriental College. He worked in Hong Kong with his father. After the fall of Japan, He went to British India. The most important thing is to provide intelligence on Pearl Harbor. Philby answered very seriously. It can be said that he knows a lot about the Far East. That goes without saying. The news must be passed on to the Soviet comrades immediately. Donald made the final decision. Greedy imperialists are not even willing to pretend to be friendly. It's really shameless. Chapter 47 heading south to Vienna. Alan Wilson had been prepared for this report to be leaked because he knew about the existence of the Cambridge Five. For now, he thought over and over again that no matter what the result was, it had nothing to do with the British Empire. Britain in 1945 was still qualified to say no to the United States. In fact, from the division of the occupation of Germany at the Yalta Conference, it can be seen that the Soviet Union occupied more than 40% of Germany's land, and the Soviet occupied area was the largest. The British occupied area occupied the Ruhr area, which was the most powerful industry in Germany, as well as the excellent coastline and ports in the northwest, and the American occupied area was Bavaria in southern Germany. The American occupied area was not as large as the Soviet Union, and it was not an industrial area. It was not as densely populated and industrially developed as the British occupied area. The Soviet Union occupied the largest land, Britain occupied the best resources and population, and the United States was very embarrassed. Now it has to divide a part of the land with Britain to France. Of course, the United States will suffer from this division, and the United States has a lot of opinions on this plan. On the one hand, it believes that the area of the Soviet occupied area is too large. On the other hand, the Ruhr area that it is interested in fell into the hands of Britain. So the United States formulated a new occupation plan. In simple terms, the new plan proposed by the Americans is to swap the American and British occupation zones. Britain occupied southern Germany, and the American occupation zone became the current British occupation zone, which of course included the Ruhr area. The diplomatic battle between Britain and the United States over the exchange of occupation zones has been going on from the Cairo Conference to the Yalta Conference. Britain has never made concessions. As the Soviet Red Army's momentum became stronger and stronger, the United States had to accept reality and honestly accept the current division. As for the origin of the French occupation zone, it was Britain that pushed the United States to the front line of confrontation with the Soviet Union. In order to win over France, Britain and France adopted a strategy of winning over France in order to contain the United States after the war. Among them, how many times the British Foreign Office and the Americans had a verbal battle, and how many times the United States suffered a loss with the assistance of the Soviet Red Army, was not something Alan Wilson could guess. He was still bathing in the glory of the sacred bull in British India. But this division of occupation zones brought about a problem. The British occupation zone actually had nothing to do with the Balkans. Tito's opponents in Yugoslavia could not actually reach the British. This is actually an illusion, because Austria was also occupied in different areas. The division of Austria was similar to that of Germany, with the Soviet Union occupying the largest area and Britain occupying the best location and population. The British occupation zone was just right for Tito's opponents. However, Austria is currently nominally occupied in different areas, but in fact, the troops of the United States, Britain and France in the occupied areas are pitifully small, almost like undefended areas. The nominal occupation zone was completely restrained by the Soviet Red Army. Because the tiger is dead, the power will not fall. In the eyes of the anti-German factions of various countries supported by Britain before the war for the purpose of fighting against Germany, Britain is still the world's first colonial empire. They don't know that Britain is exhausted and can no longer suppress the United States and the Soviet Union. They have to consider joining forces with France to protect themselves. Therefore, the Yugoslav Fatherland Army and other organizations opposed to Tito still seek to surrender to Britain. 2 days after the German surrender ceremony, Alan Wilson was considering whether to use a pack of cigarettes to find a German dragoon to clean the apartment where he was temporarily staying and to save German fallen women and help them solve their urgent needs. The British representative office in Vienna sent a telegram. Still Tito's opponents gathered at the border, including the Yugoslav Fatherland Army, the Croatian Ustasha, and the Slovenian Home Defense Force. There are so many people that I can't even name them. Among them, there may be real refugees who are afraid of being liquidated by Tito. These organizations are very complicated. The Chetniks are mainly composed of Serbs who support the Yugoslav government. They are anti-German armed forces active in Yugoslavia during World War II. Their official name is the Yugoslav Fatherland Army. The name Chetnik comes from the Serbian word. Like the King of Yugoslavia, it was supported by Britain in the early days. The Croatian Ustasha was established in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria. Its goal is to make Croatia independent from Yugoslavia, and is supported by Germany and Italy. As for the Slovenian Home Defense Force, it is another organization supported by Germany. Now these anti-Tito forces belonging to different organizations, because the Yugoslav Communist Party led by Tito has controlled Yugoslavia, driven by the instinct of survival, began to flee Yugoslavia and headed to the border of Austria and Germany to seek asylum. After smoking a cigarette and taking a rest in his room, Alan Wilson heard footsteps outside the door and immediately picked up the telegram sent from Vienna, looking very distressed. "Alan, what's wrong?" As soon as Alfred entered the room, he saw Alan Wilson's constipated expression, and he felt uncomfortable too, so he couldn't help but ask. "It's about the Balkans. The Yugoslav Fatherland Army is gathering at the Austrian border. The number has exceeded 100,000. If we don't deal with it, something might happen." Alan Wilson said worriedly, "It might happen. We should consider persuading these people to return to Yugoslavia immediately." 100,000 people. Eiffel frowned. "That's a lot of people. We have almost no troops in Austria. The nominal divisional occupation is actually just the Soviet Red Army occupying the eastern part of Austria. It stays in the occupied areas of the other 3 countries except the Soviet occupation area. There are not many troops, and it is impossible to defend. Yes, if these Yugoslavs break through the border, will we let the Austrian army intercept them?" Alan Wilson, who was awarded the Best Actor, also looked worried. A small oversight just after the end of World War II may cause big problems. Or 1,000-mile dam collapses because of an ant-hole. Unlike the German divisional occupation, the Austrian divisional occupation only exists in name. If these Yugoslav opponents are determined to cross the border at all costs, the British, French and American countries actually do not have many troops to intercept them. This is really quite embarrassing. Now we just need someone to help these people make up their minds to cross the border in an organized, planned and premeditated manner, rather than just being scattered. The Austrian representative office has been trying to persuade these people in good faith, in order to avoid the hostility of the Soviet Union. But the number of people is increasing, so we still have to be more careful. Alan Wilson said, "Why don't I go to Vienna and observe closely? If Vienna can persuade these people to return to Yugoslavia, it would be the best thing." "I hope so, even if it means tricking them." F4 nodded solemnly, agreeing with Alan Wilson's idea. As long as these Yugoslavs go back, it will be Tito's business, and has nothing to do with Britain. "Okay. I hope everything goes well." Alan Wilson agreed. Trick. How could such an honest man like him do such a thing? Chapter 48, City of Spies. Honesty is an excellent character. Alan Wilson, who set out from the city of Berlin, represented the British Empire. He was not fighting alone, and naturally he did not disdain to use lies to achieve his goals. If the final result is that these Yugoslav refugees are unwilling to go back, but deceive everyone, and forcefully cross the border, of course, he is not responsible. As a gentleman of the British Empire, he has tried his best to persuade them. In the Kremlin in Moscow, a man with a Mediterranean hairstyle and glasses passed the gaze of the Kremlin guards and slowly entered the heart of the Soviet Union. Even the guards unconsciously straightened their chests in places they passed, fearing that they would be seen by this unprepossessing man. This terrifying person is the General Political Commissar of State Security, Marshal Beria. It was not until he arrived at the door of Stalin's office that his stern expression eased a little. He knocked on the door and walked in lightly. "Now our foreign agents are using this kind of information for intelligence. Why don't we intercept news from British newspapers? Wouldn't that be more convenient?" Stalin put down the document that Beria brought and asked, "How is the matter of persuading German scientists to compensate the Soviet people going? What stage has it reached?" "Comrade Stalin, this is exactly what I want to say. In fact, the earlier intelligence and the document in front of you were from the same person. Of course, we completed this work very smoothly. After the Ministry of Internal Affairs took action, we found that the spies of the Chinese and American imperialists in the Soviet-occupied areas were taking similar actions. If we acted a step later, there would be great losses. Beria explained in a gentle voice. This was a very rare thing for him, and it was obtained from the hands of those comrades. Beria finally emphasized, imperialism has always been very hostile to the Soviet Union. We all know this very well. In fact, I have shown great goodwill. I didn't expect that these imperialists would still be indifferent. Stalin sighed. The two extremes of the enemy and us cannot coexist peacefully. Beria agreed softly. We must use all possible means to protect the great Soviet Union. At the same time, we must not miss any opportunity. I remember that the distance between Hokkaido and Sakhalin Island is only 30 kilometers, which does not seem to be an insurmountable distance. Even if it is insurmountable, the great Soviet Red Army should overcome temporary difficulties and complete the sacred mission. Stalin frowned and pondered for a moment, and then reminded, we must achieve our goals and create a fait accompli before the American Manhattan Project succeeds. Beria nodded in agreement. If there were two people in the Soviet Union who knew about this, one of them would be him, and the other would naturally be Comrade Steele. The two knew about the Manhattan Project even earlier than Truman. The Manhattan Project was a top secret in the United States. Within the US government, only President Roosevelt and a few people in charge of the Manhattan Project knew the inside story of the atomic bomb. However, after all, there were too many people involved in this project. If someone wanted to collect intelligence against the United States, they would naturally be able to find a breakthrough. In the evening, when Merkulov was about to get off work in Lubyanka, he received a call and stood at attention reflexively. Select 2 people from Kibyshev's British district to go to Germany to lurk. The target is the British occupied area. I will give you the news when the time comes. Yes, General Political Commissar. Merkulov promised readily and then picked up the phone. Connect to Bureau 10. Go to Gatsna to select agents, the most professional and loyal women who need to be proficient in both German and English. Bureau 1. Forge an identity. Germany is still in chaos at present, so this is not a difficult problem. After the arrangement was completed, Merkulov put down the phone and breathed a sigh of relief. Vienna is located on the Danube River. It is the capital and largest city of Austria. In fact, in terms of fame, Vienna has been more well known than the German capital Berlin for a long time. Of course, Vienna and even the whole of Austria are now in nominal divisional occupation like Germany. Why is it nominal? Because in addition to the Soviet Red Army, the armies of the United States, Britain and France can only be said to exist on Austrian territory, but compared with the Soviet Red Army, they are not worth mentioning. Alan Wilson rushed to Vienna like a hard-working little bee. Like Greece, the reason why Vienna was not completely occupied by the Soviet Union was also the result of Britain's dedicated mediation. Of course, according to historical development, all the achievements belong to the United States, who made Britain worse and worse. The world's spy capital. Alan Wilson muttered another name for Vienna for a long time after the war. After World War II, because of Austria's special neutral status, its capital Vienna became a battlefield for secret fronts of various countries. The secret war never stopped, and it was even more important than the world's music capital. Of course, there are British overseas institutions in Vienna, but unfortunately, Vienna is in the Soviet-occupied area. The British-occupied area, which is not smaller than the Soviet-occupied area, is near Slovenia. On the streets of Vienna, you can see groups of Soviet Red Army soldiers and fearful Austrians at a glance. In this environment, Alan Wilson, who handed over a report to London, talked about Europe all the way to Japan, and only skipped the Balkans, arrived in the city of Vienna. Alan, you've seen that the Austrians are very afraid of the Soviets. Hunter, the embassy driver who came to pick up Alan Wilson, pointed at the scene in front of him. Don't forget that Hitler is Austrian. Austrians are also Germanic people. They are not innocent at all. Alan Wilson said calmly, I heard that during the war, Austrians always mentioned the Great Germany when they spoke. Only in front of the Soviets did they emphasize that they are Austrians. Why? They cut off all ties after losing the war. If it weren't for the late sky, Alan Wilson would not have stayed in Vienna at all, but continued to the south to the British occupied zone. Unfortunately, although the war was over, the world was indeed not peaceful. He could only stay in Vienna temporarily, to rest for a while, before continuing to his destination. Even before he got familiar with the diplomats of the British embassy, the Soviets had already come to the door. It was worthy of being the Soviet occupied zone. Every move in Vienna was in the eyes of the Soviets. We look to the future, seek common ground while reserving differences, and the great glory of defeating Germany belongs to the Soviet Red Army. Alan Wilson showed a change of face that was no less than that of the Austrians. In front of others, Alan Wilson, the spokesperson for imperialism, struck hard, but in front of the Soviets, he could also be submissive. The image of mature and experienced diplomat is vividly portrayed on paper. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 49: The Gentle Diplomat. The situation in Vienna is different from that in Berlin. Basically, the Soviet Union occupies the eastern half of Berlin, and the United States, Britain and France occupy the western half. The situation in Vienna is more complicated. The Soviet Union is not only stationed in the eastern part of Vienna, but also in the western suburbs of Vienna. It can be said that the entire urban area of Vienna is surrounded by the occupied areas of the United States, Britain and France. If you want to avoid the Soviet occupied area, only the north-south road can be used. It can be said that half of the city of Berlin is occupied by the United States, Britain and France, although you have to pass through the Soviet occupied area in Germany to leave Berlin. The British, American and French occupied areas in Vienna are directly surrounded by the Soviet occupied areas in Vienna. If there is anything, the Soviet Red Army in Vienna can handle it. The reality is so cruel, it is no wonder that Alan Wilson hit hard against British India and was submissive to the Soviet Union. The visitor is a Soviet diplomat in Vienna, but he regards all unidentified Soviet diplomats as people from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It is just like the other way around. He is an informant of MI6. Alan Wilson didn't know what kind of friendship there was between the old imperialists and the Soviet Union, which wanted to liberate the world. If there was any, it would be Germany. His attitude was flattering, and his words were so disgusting that it was amazing to see the decisive role of the Soviet Red Army on the battlefield. Even the British diplomats in Vienna were shocked. Mr. Petrov, I saw that the Soviet military discipline was strict and the whole order in Vienna was amazing. I hope the friendship between the British Empire and the Soviet Union will continue. Alan Wilson kept talking, flattering the half-bald Soviet diplomat, and took out 10 boxes of cigarettes as a gift to show friendship. Mr. Allen is so polite. We just heard that there were guests in Vienna, so we came to ask out of caution. You also know that the war has just ended, and many people are very disgusted with the Allies. It can be said that Vienna is not safe. Petrov accepted Alan Wilson's benefits without leaving a trace. Who is Alan Wilson? He is a class enemy and a running dog of imperialism. If he can take advantage of him, the great motherland will commend him. It should be. The Red Army soldiers made the right decision. Personally, I think that there were so many Austrians who supported the merger of Germany and Austria. There is no need to be polite in treating these war criminals. Alan Wilson stepped hard on the Austrian, who was already lying on the ground without any hesitation. His face was full of hatred for the enemy. Whatever the Soviet Union does to treat these war criminals is right. He talked about the traditional friendship between Britain and Russia, such as the traditional friendship between the two countries when they treated Napoleon, and the joint fight against Germany during World War I. As for the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union taking the opportunity to default on its debts, Alan Wilson did not mention it because of the friendly relationship between the two countries. Anyway, Britain also defaulted on its debts to the United States. If everyone defaults on their debts, there will be no debt. Mr. Allen, we in the Soviet Union have always recognized the important role of Britain in the world. So, if you are not busy, come to the Epstein Palace tomorrow with the diplomats from the Schönbrunn Palace. Petrov nodded, impressed by this diplomat with good intentions, and directly made an invitation. This is exactly why I came to Vienna. After all, we are from different countries, and there may be some conflicts when we get along. Alan Wilson readily agreed. Of course, there are many things to talk about regarding the establishment of the post-war order in Vienna. Vienna and even Austria, to put it nicely, are currently managed by 4 countries, but in fact, Austria and the Soviet Union are almost the only ones. Alan Wilson Schönbrunn Palace is now the headquarters of the British Embassy in Vienna. Schönbrunn Palace is located in Vienna, the capital of Austria, and is one of its most famous attractions. It was originally named after the Holy Roman Emperor Matthias hunted here and drank the spring water here, which was refreshing and sweet, so he named this spring Schönbrunn, and this area was also called Schönbrunn. As a traditional Baroque art building, the majestic Schönbrunn Palace is second only to the Palace of Versailles in France. The British chose the royal palace as the headquarters in Vienna, which is naturally in line with the tradition of the monarchy of the British Empire. The Soviet Union chose the Epstein Palace, the original gathering place of politicians in the Austrian Empire, and it is very political at first glance. As for the headquarters, chosen by the United States, it is also very consistent with the characteristics of the United States of America. It is the headquarters of the Austrian National Bank. It is obvious that it is here for money. As for France, it is the largest luxury hotel in Vienna. Alan Wilson actually still has a lot of things to do. When he arrived in Vienna, he remembered that his job was not to stir up trouble at the border. Of course, he still had to go, but before that, he had to formulate the 4-country co-management mechanism in Vienna and make some basic contributions. It was not that he realized it later. He just asked the diplomats of Schönbrunn Palace and found out that these tasks had not been done. Do these local civil servants usually live such a comfortable life? Alan Wilson sighed in his heart. He was a civil servant from British India. He ran around for the British Empire, but the local diplomats were so inefficient. After Petrov left, Alan Wilson began to ask the Yugoslav refugees in the border area, Stevens, let our local diplomats try their best to delay the time, and I will deal with this matter when I arrive. Liaison officer, we want to contact the Soviet Union. Stevens asked, will this arouse suspicion? Alan Wilson is the liaison officer of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Europe. This is not a very high position. All those who came to Europe with him are liaison officers, but he is the only one who has come to Vienna. What's the matter? He is also the liaison officer of the Indian Affairs Department to British India. Just a title. We'll go with the Americans and the French. We are allies now, so it's normal to have some contact. Of course, tomorrow morning, the Americans will declare war on the Soviets, so just ignore what I said. Alan Wilson suddenly laughed when he said this, and after a while he pretended to be serious and said, what's the difference between Austria and the Soviets occupying it exclusively now? Of course, the Soviet Red Army didn't go to other occupied areas, so it's very trustworthy from this point of view. Solving the Austrian problem may take a lot of time and require the efforts of higher level diplomats, but we must at least come up with a solution for the urban area of Vienna. We can't just keep the military control all the time. The large occupied areas of Austria by the 4 countries are easy to divide, but what about the city of Vienna? Vienna's area is far smaller than that of Berlin, and the occupied areas of each country are intertwined, all surrounded by the Soviets. A citizen of Vienna may pass through different posts in the 4 countries when he goes out, and this must be solved. Even if only a draft is produced and nothing is solved, it can add a lot of color to Alan Wilson's resume. Then I'll take a rest first. Alan Wilson raised his wrist to look at his watch. He should send a telegram to Pamela Mountbatten. Chapter 50 Epstein Palace. Alan Wilson puts interests first and holds Pamela Mountbatten's legs tightly, which is not shameful. The only danger is that the Mountbatten family is of German aristocratic origin. It is well known that when the characteristics of the Germanic people are reflected in men, they are full of masculinity, but in women, I hope that Pamela Mountbatten will not become the dragoon in the mouth of the great mentor in the future. Alan Wilson, who has his life over again, has not changed in terms of aesthetics. The only group that generally feels that the aesthetic standards have exceeded are Eastern Europeans, or to be more direct, Maoris. It's a pity that they are in the enemy camp, which is a pity. Communicating with the Allied forces, Alan Wilson reported the situation in Vienna truthfully and asked when the Allied forces would enter Vienna. Now in the entire Austria, he is not good at describing the so-called military personnel. Can they be described as troops, especially compared with the Soviet garrisons? However, there are also advantages to the short vacuum period. The US, UK, and France occupied areas were actually in an undefended state. If refugees really poured in, there was actually no actual stopping force. I really don't know whether the British diplomats in history were particularly capable or the Yugoslav Home Army was particularly naive. They were persuaded to go back and were killed by Tito as expected. With Alan Wilson, he may not be as capable as other diplomats. If he can't succeed, can he fail? Before going to the Epstein Palace, the Soviet headquarters in Vienna, Alan Wilson also received a reply from the Allied headquarters. He directly skipped the useless wording that occupied 9/10 of the telegram and looked at the last line. In short, he communicated with the Soviet side according to the procedures and expected to complete the preparations for the stationing in the fall. Japan is about to surrender. Alan Wilson rolled his eyes. It was really a pity that the Soviet Union did not have such a shameless old imperialism, or that the interests of Eastern Europe after the war had satisfied the Soviet Union in a short period of time. Otherwise it would have lost everything. The only benefit was that in the months of being defenseless, Alan Wilson had much more time to prepare. If the refugees finally crossed the border, it was undoubtedly these despicable Yugoslavs who deceived the young British diplomat. The next day, together with the diplomats from the United States and France, Alan Wilson went to the Epstein Palace to celebrate the main theme of 1945, the unity of the participating countries to maintain world peace. The country was controlled by 4 other countries, and a city was divided into 4 parts. How should people live here? There were actually many conflicts of interest and games between the 4 countries stationed here. Vienna was full of people with all kinds of purposes. It was a complex and chaotic city. Vienna was not like Berlin on one side and half. The jurisdictions in the city were very complicated. On the way to the Epstein Palace, Alan Wilson saw that the citizens of Vienna were planting potatoes on the land of the city park. Even if he had never been to Vienna, he could imagine that the original park should be a sea of flowers. The black market in Vienna is rampant now, and the price of food can't be controlled at all. Stevens saw this scene and introduced, "It's not as eye-catching as Berlin." This is true. In fact, Berlin is not short of food, and even tobacco and alcohol will not be in short supply for long. Berlin's political status is there. Even if it temporarily ignores other parts of Germany, the United States and the Soviet Union will soon guarantee Berlin's daily supply. Vienna is not so lucky. It is also the capital of a country, but it is far less important than Berlin in the eyes of the Allies. I will talk to American diplomats about this matter and try not to let black soldiers in the US military enter Austria. Alan Wilson nodded and said, "To be honest, I have forgotten about the relevant things. Those arrogant Americans, if no one tells them, they dare to lie on the ground and say that they are aping the earth." Alan Wilson's heart moved. In this era, Europe has not been shrouded by white leftists. Once something happens between soldiers in the army and local women, it is okay if there are no sequelae, but if a child is born. As for the children left by soldiers from other countries, there is no such problem, but there is an exception: American black soldiers. Black soldiers are different from white soldiers. This is a purely racial issue. Although Britain and France are not as strong as they were before the outbreak of World War II, they can use other means without the money of the United States. Alan Wilson recalled that in the more than 10 years after the end of World War II, the impression of Americans in the eyes of Europeans has always been that of uncultured country bumpkins. This impression may be the result of propaganda warfare, and it may be that Britain and France first created it. Once the matter of Yugoslavia is completed, Alan Wilson is ready to investigate the crime of black soldiers in the US military. "Mr. Petrov, we are here." As soon as he entered the Epstein Palace, Alan Wilson opened his arms and showed friendship in front of American and French diplomats without avoiding suspicion. "Mr. Allen, welcome." Petrov laughed and hugged Alan Wilson. The Epstein Palace was brightly lit, in sharp contrast to the withering business outside. The cocktail party must be held, and things must be discussed. Now Austria is under the control of 100,000 Red Army troops. Regarding the division of occupation and the management methods of Vienna, everyone must not be shy about anything. Friendship is just the political correctness of 1945, and the interests that should be fought for must also be fought for. It was during the actual Soviet occupation of Austria that Alan Wilson brought American and French diplomats to the Epstein Palace. The Soviets were not like the wealthy man with the same name as the Epstein Palace, who arranged girls and larder for these imperialist guests, so everyone should not be polite. Although there was no formal negotiation, the diplomatic rhetoric was full of confrontations. In short, who has the final say in Vienna? This is basically a preview of the future battle for Berlin. He also had to go to the Yugoslav border, and was eager to leave his mark on the draft. Although he did not expect to make any decisions, he could prepare for future successors. The first thing to do was to solve the circulation problem in Vienna, and Alan Wilson received support from the United States and France. He didn't know that he could get the support of a general political commissar. After 3 days of mediation, diplomats from the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain and France finally issued a Vienna ID card. If you want to cross the boundaries between the occupation zones, you must produce an identity document issued by the Allies. This document is written in 4 languages: German, English, French, and Russian. It is reviewed by all the authorities of the 4 countries stationed in Austria. Each document needs to be stamped with 11 seals. I went to the Public Security Bureau during the day. I was in a hurry, so I sent it without checking. There are many typos, right? This is part of life. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.